That girl climbed into a Mafia boss's car at midnight, not because she was brave, but because she was so tired she wasn't afraid of dying anymore. It was a night in November, and Boston was drowning in rain so cold it felt like it could slice skin. Bryn Holloway dragged her feet out of St. Catherine's Hospital after 14 hours on shift. Her dark green scrubs stuck to her body, her hands still faintly carrying the sharp, medicinal bite of betadine, because today, a 6-year-old child had died in her hands, and no amount of soap could wash away what that felt like. Her ride app showed a black sedan waiting. She didn't check the plate. She didn't look at who was inside. She just got in, let out a breath against the warmth of the leather seats, and said, "Maple Street. And if you could drive faster than the speed at which I want to pass out, that'd be great, because I'm giving myself about 90 more seconds." Exactly 90 seconds later, she was asleep, her head tipping onto the shoulder of the man beside her. But that car wasn't an Uber, and that man wasn't the driver. That man was Merrick Kane, and the last time someone accidentally touched his shoulder without permission, they didn't get the chance to make the same mistake twice. Garrett Hale, his right hand, the one who'd followed Merrick for 14 years, flicked his eyes to the rearview mirror, his hand drifting toward the weapon under the seat. "Sir, how do you want this handled?" Merrick didn't answer. He was watching her face in the dim light, the deep hollows beneath her eyes, the employee badge clipped to her chest, the small smear of blood on her sleeve that hadn't been washed away yet, and tears slipping quietly down her cheek in sleep, not because she was afraid of him, but because of something far heavier than fear. Her lips moved, forming 2 words so soft he had to lean in to catch them. "Pay. I'm sorry." He didn't know who Pay was. He didn't know what she was apologizing for. But the way she said those 2 words, in her sleep, on the shoulder of a killer, in the voice of someone who'd carried guilt for too long, made his hand loosen from the gun. "Drive," Merrick said quietly. "Slowly. Circle the block. Not handle her, not throw her out. Just drive." Because for the first time in many years, someone was resting their head on his shoulder and not seeing a monster. And that feeling, the feeling of being treated like an ordinary man, was more dangerous than any bullet he'd ever dodged. Because bullets, he knew how to avoid. But the woman crying on his shoulder tonight, she would change everything. She would make him love. She would make him bleed. She would make Merrick Kane do something no one in the entire underground empire of America's East Coast would ever dare to imagine. But that was later. Tonight, he just drove, slowly, with her on his shoulder. If you believe that sometimes a mistake leads us to the right person, hit like. Share this with someone who needs to hear this story tonight. And subscribe, turn on the bell, because Bryn and Merrick's journey is only just beginning. The phone vibrated. Then it vibrated again. Then once more. Bryn Holloway didn't open her eyes right away, because her body was sunk into the deepest sleep she'd known in years. The kind of sleep she thought she'd forgotten how to reach a long time ago. But the vibration didn't stop, and the instinct of an emergency room nurse wouldn't let her ignore any signal more than 3 times. She opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was fabric. Black, smooth, expensive. The kind of fabric she'd only ever seen in magazines, not pressed beneath her cheek on the shoulder of the man beside her. Then she smelled cologne, a scent of cedarwood mixed with old whiskey that didn't belong to any Uber in the world. Then she looked down at her hand and realized her fingers were wrapped tightly around the wrist of a strange man, gripping as if, in her sleep, she'd found something to hold on to and refused to let go. The message on her phone screen lit up, Peyton's words staring back at her. "Sis, are you home yet? I'm worried." And in that exact moment, Bryn Holloway's mind finally caught up with reality. She jolted upright as if the leather seat beneath her had burst into flames. Her heart slammed wildly, pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, in her throat, in every trembling fingertip. The man beside her didn't move. He was still there, still in the same position, still watching her with eyes the color of a winter sea, cold and unreadable, holding an expression she couldn't decipher. Not angry, not annoyed, not threatening, almost curious, as if she were a problem he hadn't solved yet. Bryn swallowed, tried to force her voice to steady, and failed miserably. "Oh my God, this isn't an Uber." The man tilted his head slightly. "No. And you're not the driver." "Also no." "Okay." Bryn drew in a deep breath, the kind she used before stepping into an emergency room where someone was bleeding out. "You're not going to kill me, right? Because I should say up front, I don't know anything. I'm just a nurse. I was exhausted and got into the wrong car. I owe $4,200 in hospital bills for my sister. So if you're thinking ransom, I'm really sorry in advance. And if you're thinking of killing me then, honestly, dying right now would be incredibly inconvenient because I've got a shift tomorrow at 6 in the morning and there's no one to cover it. She spoke in one long rush without stopping, because Bryn Holloway had learned a long time ago that when she was afraid, she talked. A lot. Fast. She talked until fear had no room left to slip between the words. The man listened in silence until she finished. Then the corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close enough that Bryn almost forgot she was sitting in the car of a stranger, with a gun hidden under his tailored jacket. "If I wanted to kill you," he said, his voice low and even. The voice of a man used to giving orders, not explanations. "You wouldn't still be breathing to recite your financial balance sheet to me." Bryn blinked. She didn't know how to react to a sentence that was threatening, sarcastic, and somehow reassuring all at once. Then he added, softer, lower, almost as if it were meant only for her. "You cried in your sleep. Did you know that?" The world stopped. Bryn felt as though all the air had been pulled out of the luxury car. She didn't cry in front of people. Ever. She cried in the bathroom after shifts, cried into her pillow at 2 in the morning, cried alone in the kitchen staring at stacks of medical bills, but she never cried where anyone could see, because Bryn Holloway was strong. Bryn Holloway carried everything. Bryn Holloway wasn't allowed to be weak, because if she fell apart, who would stand up for Peyton? And yet this stranger, a man whose name she didn't even know, knew something no one else in the world knew, that in her sleep, when she no longer had the strength to control it, she cried. "I don't," she started, then didn't know what she was denying, because he'd seen it, he'd heard it, and lying to someone who was looking straight at her, like that was no different from trying to cover a fire with a sheet of paper. She fell silent. He didn't say anything more either. The silence settled between them like a living thing, heavy and fragile at the same time. Then he said something to the driver, short and decisive, and the car changed direction. Bryn looked out the window and realized they were heading toward her neighborhood. He knew the address. She'd said it at the beginning, hadn't she? Maple Street, the corner apartment building. She'd handed her home address to a dangerous stranger and fallen asleep on his shoulder. Her survival instincts desperately needed maintenance. The car stopped in front of her old building. Bryn opened the door and stepped out, her feet meeting the wet, cold sidewalk. The rain was still falling, lighter than before, but enough to soak through her thin scrubs in seconds. She turned back, meaning to say thank you, then realized how absurd it was to thank a stranger for not killing her. Before she could speak, the rear window lowered halfway, and the man's face appeared under the streetlight, clear for the first time. High cheekbones, a sharp jaw, a few premature strands of gray at his temples, and gray-blue eyes watching her with a look she'd remember long after this night. "Be more careful next time," he said. "Not every car forgives a wrong turn." The window slid up. The black Cadillac glided away into the rain, smooth and silent, as if it had never existed. Bryn stood on the sidewalk for 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 20 seconds, watching the taillights fade and disappear at the end of the street. Then she went inside, climbed 3 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken again, opened the tiny studio she called home, locked the door, slid the bolt, leaned her back against the wood, and slowly sank down to sit on the floor. Her heart was still racing, her hands were still shaking, but the strangest thing about tonight, the thing that kept her sitting there on the cold floor unable to stand, wasn't that she'd gotten into the wrong car. It wasn't that she'd sat beside a man who could have killed her without blinking. It was this, that for 50 minutes, on the shoulder of a stranger, inside a car she never should have entered, beside a man she should have feared, Bryn Holloway had slept better than she had since the night her mother held her hand one last time and closed her eyes 13 years ago. And she didn't know what to do with that truth. She only knew how to sit there in the dark, knees drawn to her chest, and for the first time in a very long while, Bryn Holloway didn't cry. Not because she was strong, but because she'd already cried enough tonight, on the shoulder of a man whose name she didn't even know. 5 days passed, and Bryn Holloway tried to forget. She went to work, went home, slept 4 hours, ate instant noodles standing in the kitchen, and then went to work again. The old rhythm, the old loop, the old safe world she'd built out of exhaustion and discipline over so many years. But every time she stepped out of the gates of St. Catherine's Hospital at night, her eyes automatically swept the parking lot, searching for a black Cadillac. Every dark sedan sliding by on the road made her heart jump once, a beat she didn't permit. Every night, lying on her bed in the cramped studio, she remembered the warmth of leather, the scent of cedar wood, and the solid shoulder under her cheek. And then she scolded herself for remembering that night the way you remember a beautiful dream instead of a nightmare. She didn't tell anyone. Not Jenna, her closest coworker, because Jenna would call the police and then make her call the FBI too. Not Peyton, because her sister would worry herself into sleeplessness. And Peyton needed sleep, needed rest, needed to pour every ounce of strength into healing. She didn't even write it in her journal, the notebook that had held every secret since she was 14, because writing it down would mean it was real. And Bryn needed it to not be real, needed it to be nothing more than one strange rainy night that vanished like steam on a car window. But then, on the 4th day after that night, the real world knocked, and it didn't knock gently. The call came from Peyton's rehabilitation center, the administrator's voice polite but cold, the voice of someone who'd said this sentence too many times to too many families. Insurance had refused to cover the next round of therapy. Reason: the plan's annual limit had been exceeded for the fiscal year. If Bryn couldn't find $4,200 a month within 2 weeks, Peyton's rehabilitation program would be interrupted. And the doctor had made it very clear, not in a soothing tone, but in the tone of someone forcing themselves to tell the truth, even knowing it would hurt, that if therapy stopped at this stage, Peyton's chance of walking would drop from 40% to under 10%. Irreversible. No exceptions. The human body doesn't wait for anyone to have enough money. Bryn started looking for a way. She always found a way. Always. Ever since she was 16, and her father walked out and left 2 sisters with an empty refrigerator and a stack of overdue bills. She had found a way. She applied for a bank loan, waited 40 minutes in a small branch office near the hospital, watched the employee type at the keyboard, and then shake his head without meeting her eyes. Denied. Credit too poor, too many late payments, income not sufficient to guarantee the loan. She asked coworkers, forcing her voice to sound as normal as possible in the staff break room, as if she were borrowing a pen and not a sum equal to 2 months of wages. Jenna looked at her with eyes full of pity but shook her head, because Jenna was raising 2 children on her own too. She called 3 different social service agencies, sat through hold music for a total of 2 hours and 40 minutes across 3 days, only to be told the waiting list was 6 months. 6 months. Peyton didn't have 6 months. Peyton's legs didn't have 6 months. On the 5th night, Bryn stood in the kitchen of her studio. The fluorescent light flickered overhead because the bulb was dying, and she didn't have the money to replace it. On the refrigerator door, medical bills were layered over each other under cheap magnets, and the number $4,200 sat there, bold and red, like blood on white paper. Beside the fridge, on the small bookshelf she'd bought secondhand, there was a photograph. Peyton smiling, standing on 2 feet, sunlight behind her, hair lifting in the wind. The photo had been taken 3 months before the accident, when her sister still danced, still ran, still spun in the living room because her favorite song had come on. Bryn stared at the photo, stared at the bills, stared at the photo, stared at the bills, and for the first time in many years, since the night she was 16, standing in this same kitchen, with a pot of rice burned black, and her little sister crying from hunger, Bryn Holloway couldn't find a way. She had pushed through everything, had found an exit in every dead end, had clenched her teeth and walked through nights that felt like they had no tomorrow. But this time, every door was shut, every road led into a wall, and Peyton was in that rehabilitation center believing her sister would handle it, would always handle it, because Bryn had never failed. Not once. She pressed her hand against the cold refrigerator door, lowered her head, closed her eyes, and felt the weight of 2 words she had never accepted in her life. No way out. A 14-hour shift ended close to midnight, and Bryn Holloway walked out through the gates of St. Catherine's Hospital with burning eyes, legs heavy as if they were strapped with lead, and a new habit she'd trained into herself for 6 nights now, checking the license plate. She opened the ride app, stared at the screen, read every letter, every number on the registration for a silver Honda Civic approaching the hospital, and matched it 3 times just to be sure. Not again. Never again. She slipped her phone into her scrub pocket, started toward the pickup area, and at that exact moment, the soft purr of another engine slid toward her out of the darkness. A glossy black Cadillac CT6 stopped right in front of her, less than 3 steps away, and Bryn felt her heart do the one thing she'd been forcing it not to do for 5 days. It jumped. The driver's window lowered. The face she remembered as the man who drove that night appeared, still stone cold, still with sharp eyes that assessed her quickly, efficiently, like a barcode scan. "Miss Holloway," he said. And those 2 words made the blood in Bryn's veins go a few degrees colder, because she had never told anyone in that car her name. She had given an address, had said she wanted to go home, had said she'd pass out in 90 seconds, but she had not said her name. They'd found her name. They knew where she worked, what shift she had, which gate she walked out of. And they came back. "Mr. Kane wants to see you," the driver said. Then, from inside the car, that low voice she'd tried to forget for 5 days sounded calm, with a trace of something she hadn't expected to hear. "Humor. I promise I won't bite. And this time I brought tissues, just in case you cry again." Bryn stood there in the hospital parking lot, fine November drizzle floating around her. To her left, the silver Honda Civic had arrived, its turn signal blinking softly, the real Uber driver waiting. Safe, ordinary, the right plate, the right color, everything about it exactly what her life was supposed to be. To her right, the black Cadillac sat like an invitation from a world she didn't belong to, its rear door already cracked open, pale gold light spilling onto the wet pavement. And inside Bryn's head, it wasn't logic or survival instinct that spoke. It was a number. $4,200. It flashed behind her eyelids like an emergency light, red and urgent, refusing to let her look away. She looked at the Honda Civic, then at the Cadillac, then she walked toward the Cadillac, because Bryn Holloway had run out of choices. And when someone has stood in front of a wall with no doors for long enough, any door that opens, no matter where it leads, becomes the only door. She slid into the back seat. The door closed with a familiar soft click. The scent of cedar wood and old whiskey lingered, and her body betrayed her by letting her shoulders loosen, because it remembered this place, remembered this warmth, remembered the false safety her mind knew was a lie, but her bones still wanted to believe. Merrick Kane sat across from her, at just enough distance not to invade her space, but close enough that she could see his face clearly in the dim light. He was dressed differently than that night, no longer in a black suit, but in a dark knit sweater, less frightening, and somehow more frightening, because it was much easier to stay guarded around a man who looked like a crime boss than around a man who looked almost ordinary. The car began to move, smooth and slow, and Merrick Kane began to speak. He didn't circle. He spoke like a man used to negotiation, laying everything on the table from the start, hiding no cards. His mother, Catherine Kane, 68 years old, had early-stage Parkinson's, and she refused to go to any hospital, for reasons he didn't explain, but Bryn could guess had nothing to do with personal preference. He needed a nurse to care for her at home, skilled, reliable, discreet. That was the first part. Then he paused, just long enough for Bryn to understand that the next part was the part that mattered. "Sometimes," he said, choosing each word the way someone sets down bricks one by one, "my people need medical care they don't want to seek in a hospital. Not bullet extractions or hiding bodies, nothing from the movies. But there are injuries that, if they show up in an emergency room, come with questions no one wants to answer." He looked straight into her eyes. "Part 1 is taking care of a cranky old lady. Part 2 is putting one foot into a world where you may not like what you see. I need you to understand that before you agree." The pay was 4 times her current income. The number hovered between them like something alive, and Bryn felt it touch the exact wound that was still bleeding inside her. $4,200 a month. Peyton's legs. A 40% chance that was shrinking by the day. "Why me?" she asked, and her voice was steadier than she expected, because she'd been thinking this question since the moment the Cadillac stopped in front of her. "You can hire anyone. Someone more experienced, someone who knows your world, someone who doesn't get in the wrong car and fall asleep on a stranger's shoulder. Why me?" Merrick Kane was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke, and his voice changed, softer, lower, losing the sharp edge of a negotiator and becoming something Bryn couldn't name. "Because you cried in your sleep and called the name of someone you love. On the shoulder of a killer. You didn't know who I was, you didn't know what I could do, and you still rested your head on my shoulder and cried for someone you love." He paused. "I need someone like that beside my mother. Someone who can still love while standing in the dark." He handed her a business card. Small, white, with only a name and a line of numbers. No title, no company, no logo, no sign at all of who this man was in a world the streetlights didn't reach. The car stopped in front of her building. Bryn stepped out, the card sitting in her palm, its sharp edge pressing lightly into her skin. She climbed 3 flights of stairs, opened her door, stepped into the studio, and stood in the middle of the room, staring at 3 things. Peyton's medical bill taped to the refrigerator, $4,200, blazing red. The photo of Peyton smiling on the bookshelf, standing on 2 feet, hair lifting in the wind. And the business card in her hand, bright white, only a name and a number she knew. If she called it, she would never return to her old life. She looked at the bill, looked at Peyton, looked at the card. A 40% chance to walk. 10%, irreversible. She lifted her phone, dialed, and brought it to her ear. Merrick Kane answered on the first ring, as if he'd been sitting there with the phone in his hand, waiting. And maybe he had been waiting. 1 week after that call, Bryn Holloway stood in front of an iron gate twice her height in the suburbs of Boston, staring at the house beyond it and wondering what she was walking into. She'd imagined so many things on the way here, sitting in an Uber whose license plate she'd checked 3 times this time. She'd pictured a dark building, gray concrete, steel doors, cameras everywhere, maybe a few hard-faced men on watch with guns tucked under their jackets. What she saw wasn't that. A Georgian-style mansion sat in the middle of a wide garden, warm red brick, tall white windows, old maple trees flanking the entrance like gentle gatekeepers who'd stood there for 100 years. There were flowers. There was autumn sunlight gilding the stone steps. There was the smell of damp, decaying leaves and earth after rain. It looked like a home someone truly lived in, truly loved, not the headquarters of an underground empire. And that was what unsettled Bryn more than any concrete wall could have. Because the most dangerous things in this world were always the ones that looked safe. Garrett Hale waited at the front door, the same expressionless face she remembered from that night. The face of a man who'd trained himself to hide every thought beneath skin, the way you hide a blade under a coat. He nodded at her. No smile, no coldness, simply acknowledging her existence with a single nod before stepping aside. And Bryn had the vague sense that Garrett Hale was the kind of man who would open the door for her to enter, and would also close that door forever, without hesitation if she made a mistake. He led her through a spacious foyer, down an oak-lined hallway, past a sitting room where the painting on the wall was probably worth more than her entire studio, and stopped in front of a door on the east side of the house. The medical room. Bryn stepped inside, and for the second time that day, what she saw wasn't what she'd imagined. The clinic was clean, professional, fully equipped, no different from a high-end private practice. An exam table, medicine cabinets, a blood pressure monitor, a heart rate monitor, even a small hospital bed with sheets so white they looked untouched. Everything had been arranged by someone who understood medicine, or at least understood that medicine required precision. Then she met Catherine Kane, and everything she'd prepared in her mind, every layer of armor she'd built, every quiet mantra of, "This is only a job, keep your distance, go in and get out, don't get involved," began to waver. Catherine sat in the sitting room adjoining the medical space, in a deep blue velvet armchair, spine straight, silver hair pinned neatly back, gray-blue eyes identical to her son's taking Bryn in from head to toe without missing a detail. She looked like a queen who'd stepped down but had never once forgotten she'd worn a crown. "So you're the girl who slept in my son's car," she said, her voice old Boston, sharp as a razor and warm in the most unexpected place. Interesting. The last time a woman dared get close to him without shaking, it must have been his grandmother's day. Bryn laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a social laugh, but a real laugh. A sound that broke loose from somewhere in her chest she'd thought had sealed itself shut a long time ago. For the first time in months, her face loosened from joy instead of tightening to hide exhaustion. And Catherine watched her laugh with eyes that knew everything. The eyes of a woman who'd lived long enough in darkness to recognize light the moment it walked through the door. Catherine started talking, and Bryn realized she wasn't the kind of patient who sat still and listened to doctors. She was the kind of patient who made doctors sit still and listen to her. She talked about Boston weather when she was young, about parties where she'd worn wide-brimmed hats and drank champagne, about Mr. Kane, her husband, in a voice that was both loving and scolding, as if he were still sitting right there so she could keep nagging him. Sharp, darkly funny, and tender in the most sudden moments. Bryn listened, and something in her chest tightened, because Catherine reminded her of her own grandmother, the woman who'd taught her how to tie her hair and tucked blankets around her on nights. Her mother had to work late shifts before her grandmother died, before Bryn's world began falling apart piece by piece. She felt something familiar and warm, something she didn't dare believe was real, because Bryn had learned that warm things in her life rarely stayed for long. Merrick appeared when Catherine signaled for the housekeeper to wheel her away for her afternoon rest. He stood in the doorway, leaning back, arms folded across his chest, watching Bryn with gray-blue eyes she couldn't read, and Bryn remembered that this was the first time she was seeing him in full daylight. He looked different, no longer a shadow in the back seat of a car on a rainy night, but a man of flesh and bone, with calluses on his hands, a few strands of gray at his temples, and a way of standing slightly tilted to the left, like someone used to carrying weight on one side of his shoulder. Bryn drew in a breath and spoke, because she needed to speak before Catherine's warmth and the autumn sun in the garden made her forget where she was. "I have 2 conditions," she said, in her emergency room voice, steady, no retreat. "First, if anyone comes into this clinic with a life-threatening injury, I call emergency services. I don't care how much trouble it causes or how many questions it brings. I won't let someone die to keep your secrets. No negotiation." Merrick didn't nod, didn't shake his head. He only watched her, and waited. "Second, if I find out you lied to me, that this place is used for something harmful, that I'm a piece in some game of yours, I disappear. No negotiation, no second chance, never coming back. You will never find me again." She knew that last line was an exaggeration, because if Merrick Kane could find her name within 5 days when she hadn't said it, finding her anywhere probably wouldn't be much harder than that. But she needed to say it, needed him to hear it, needed him to understand that she was stepping into this world on her own feet, not being dragged into it. The silence held for a few seconds. Then Merrick nodded, slow, once. "Fine." He stepped forward and held out his hand. Bryn looked at his hand, then took it. Warm, firm without forcing, holding just long enough for her to feel the pulse under his wrist. Then he let go, and Bryn forced herself not to think about what that hand had felt like in hers. She was here for Peyton, for $4,200, for her sister's legs, not for any other reason. She repeated it in her mind like a spell, followed Garrett to see the rest of the clinic, and tried not to look back to where Merrick Kane stood, watching her walk away with eyes she could feel burning at the back of her neck with every step. The first month in the Kane mansion passed, and Bryn Holloway realized that caring for Catherine Kane wasn't like any job she'd ever had. At St. Catherine's Hospital, patients came and went. She met them in the worst moments of their lives, and then never saw them again. And the professional distance between nurse and patient was always as clear as the white lines on the road. But Catherine wasn't a patient. She was a force. Every morning Bryn went into her room to take her blood pressure, check the tremor in her hands, manage her Parkinson's medication on a schedule precise to the minute. And every morning Catherine turned the medical check into an afternoon tea without tea, filled instead with stories Bryn couldn't not listen to. She talked about Boston when she was young, about winters so cold your tears froze before they could fall, about Mr. Kane in a voice that scolded and loved at the same time, as if he were still sitting right there making her mad. She talked about Merrick as a boy. And that was when Bryn realized she wasn't listening out of politeness anymore. She was listening because she wanted to. "He liked to draw," Catherine said while Bryn measured her pulse, and Catherine's voice suddenly softened, like the wind shifting. From the moment he could hold a pencil, he drew houses. Not the way children draw. 4 walls and a triangle roof. He drew staircases. He drew windows. He even drew the way light fell into the sitting room at 4 in the afternoon. When he was 12, he told me, "Mom, I'm going to build houses for people to live in. Not big houses, just beautiful ones. Houses that, when someone opens the door and steps inside, they feel like they want to stay." She paused and looked out the window, and her hand, trembling lightly from Parkinson's, trembled a little more from something that had nothing to do with the disease. Then everything changed. She didn't say more, and Bryn didn't ask, but she understood that everything changed was Catherine's way of speaking about something too painful to name. In the days that followed, Bryn sank into a new rhythm. Mornings with Catherine, afternoons checking the clinic, evenings video calling Peyton and then driving back to her studio. She began to know every corner of the mansion, which stair creaked, which window opened east to catch early sun, that Garrett drank black coffee with no sugar, and stood watch in the west hallway every night with the posture of a man who never truly rested. And she began to grow used to Merrick Kane's presence at the edge of her vision, never too close, but never fully absent, as if he circled her on an orbit they both pretended not to notice. Then, the first gray shift arrived. She was cleaning the clinic late one afternoon when the door opened and a man walked in. Around 40, big, wearing a leather jacket, and his right hand was bruised. Not the kind of bruising from a fall or an accident. Bryn had worked emergency long enough to recognize that shape instantly. 4 knuckles swollen evenly, skin split at the middle joints, dried blood under the nails. This was a hand that had punched something, or someone, hard and many times. "Fell down the stairs," the man said, not meeting her eyes, his voice flat, like he was reciting a line he'd memorized. Bryn looked at his hand, looked up into his eyes. She didn't find regret there. She didn't find aggression. She didn't find pleasure or pride. Only exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion she was used to seeing in the mirror every morning. She put on gloves, opened the medicine cabinet, took out cotton, alcohol, gauze. She treated him. No questions. She cleaned the wound, checked the bone, applied ointment, wrapped the bandage, every motion exact and professional the way she'd done it 1,000 times in the emergency room, and through it all she didn't say a word, except the medical instructions he needed. The man nodded a thank you and left. The door closed. Bryn stood alone in the quiet clinic, staring at the blood-stained gauze on the glaring white steel table. She had treated someone who had hurt someone else. She knew it. She hadn't asked, hadn't reported, hadn't called the police, hadn't done any of the things her medical oath had taught her she was supposed to do. She had only wrapped the hand and let him walk out. And the scariest part wasn't that she had done it. It was how easy it had been. Her hands hadn't shaken. Her heart hadn't raced. She had only treated him like a machine. And now she stood here, looking at the blood-stained gauze, and wondering where she was on the line between right and wrong. She'd once believed was as clear as the white lines on the road. Light footsteps behind her. Merrick walked in, didn't say anything, and set a cup of coffee on the table. Beside the blood-stained gauze, the hot coffee sent up steam, warm and fragrant, with exactly the amount of milk she liked, though she couldn't remember telling anyone. He didn't ask how the shift had gone, didn't explain, didn't justify. He just set the coffee down and left. Bryn stared at the cup, stared at the gauze, 2 things lying side by side on the white table, one belonging to a warm, ordinary world, and one belonging to darkness, and the boundary between them was so thin she wasn't sure it still existed, or had dissolved into the air without her noticing. That night, Bryn went back to her studio, took a hot shower until the water heater ran out, put on pajamas, and stood in front of the living room wall. Her nursing license hung there in a cheap wooden frame, beside the only graduation photo she'd been able to afford to print. Under the certificate was the small line she'd read the day she received it, read through proud tears because she was a motherless kid, abandoned by her father, raising her sister since she was 16, and she'd still graduated, still passed, still become a nurse. Primum non nocere. First, do no harm. She read the words again. Then again. Then her phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from the rehabilitation center. Peyton completed this week's therapy. Good progress. The doctor's assessment is positive. Attached was a photo of Peyton smiling in her wheelchair, both hands raised as if she'd just won something. And that smile, that bright smile that had no idea her sister was standing on a blurred line to keep it alive. Bryn looked at the message, looked at the certificate, looked at the message, and she chose. Not right, not wrong, just Peyton, the way she always chose. It happened on an afternoon when Bryn Holloway wasn't looking for anything more complicated than a clean hand towel. She'd just finished a light session with Catherine, balance work and finger flexing that Catherine performed, with the expression of a woman enduring the greatest humiliation of her life. I once danced the waltz with the French ambassador, and now I'm sitting here squeezing a rubber ball. And Bryn needed a towel because Catherine had spilled water on the table while lifting her hand to prove she used to have the most flexible wrist in all of Boston. The clinic was out of clean towels, and Bryn remembered she'd seen a supply cabinet at the far end of the west hallway, near a wing she'd never entered, because Garrett had made it very clear on the first day that the west side of the second floor was private, not connected to her work. But that day Garrett wasn't home, and the door at the end of the hall was slightly open. Bryn pushed it, thinking it was a storage room. The door swung wide, and she stopped cold. This wasn't storage. This was a rehabilitation room. Brand new. Slip-resistant flooring. Handrails along both walls. A gate trainer with an overhead harness. An electric tilt bed. Sets of lightweights sorted by color. A full-length mirror so patients could watch their posture. Bryn knew this room, not because she'd ever been here, but because she'd seen it hundreds of times in the glossy brochures she brought home from Peyton's rehab center, those shiny pages printed with photos of modern therapy gyms that she folded down small and kept in her wallet, pulling them out every night before bed, the way you look at a picture of a dream you can't afford to buy. The equipment in this room wasn't for Parkinson's. Parkinson's needed balance drills, finger work, slow walking. This room had parallel bars for stepping. It had harness support for body weight. It had neuromuscular electrical stimulation. This was a room built for spinal cord injury. Exactly the kind Peyton needed. Exactly the model of machine Peyton's doctor had recommended but the rehab center couldn't afford. Every detail exact, as if someone had read her sister's medical chart and built the room to order. "My mother needs," Merrick Kane's voice came from behind her. He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, and before he could finish the sentence, Bryn spun around. Her eyes were bright, not with emotion, not with gratitude, but with anger. Anger so sharp, her hands shook, her jaw clenched. And when she spoke, her voice was colder than it had ever been with him. Colder even than the night she woke up in his car and asked if he was going to kill her. "You investigated me," she said, and each word dropped between them like a stone thrown into still water. "You know about Peyton. You know what's wrong with her, what she needs, what she's missing. You built this room, so I'd owe you. So I'd look at this equipment every day and remember I can't leave because my sister needs it. You think you can buy me, Merrick? Buy me with coffee, with a high salary, with a rehab room." She brushed past him and slammed the rehab room door so hard the sound echoed down the hallway. And she went straight for the stairs, moving fast, not looking back, because if she looked back she would cry. And she wouldn't allow herself to cry in front of him. Not now. Not when she was so furious. Her whole body was vibrating with the feeling of being betrayed by the very man she had begun, even against her will, to trust. Footsteps behind her, faster than hers. Merrick followed, and what made Bryn stop wasn't that he called her name, but his voice. His voice was different, completely different. No longer low, and even like a man used to commanding, no longer calm and controlled like every other time she'd heard him speak. It sounded helpless, clumsy, almost in pain, like a man trying to explain something he didn't even know how to name. "I didn't build it to buy you," he said, and Bryn stopped midway down the staircase, her back to him, her hand gripping the railing. "You cried in your sleep and said your sister's name, on my shoulder, that night, and since that night I haven't been able to stop thinking that if there was anything I could do, anything in the world, to keep you from crying like that again, then I wanted to do it." He paused, drew in a breath, and the next sentence sounded like it was being pulled out of somewhere very deep inside him. A place Bryn suspected very few people had ever been allowed to hear from. "I don't know how to care about someone without making them afraid, Bryn. I grew up in a world where caring means control, protecting means locking someone up, and giving means creating debt. This is the only way I know, and I know it's wrong, but I don't know another way." Silence. Bryn stood there with her back still turned, and she felt the anger in her chest changing shape. Not disappearing, not shrinking, but shifting into something more complicated, something that was anger and hurt and tenderness and understanding all at once, because she thought of her mother, the woman who worked 3 jobs at once to raise 2 children, but never said "I love you," because she hadn't been taught how to say it, only how to do it. And Merrick Kane, the boss of an East Coast underground empire, was standing on the stairs telling her he didn't know how to care for someone without making them afraid, and that was probably the most honest thing he'd ever said to anyone. Tears came. Bryn cried, quietly, soundless, tears sliding down her cheeks but her shoulders steady, because these weren't tears of anger anymore. These were tears because she couldn't remember the last time someone tried to do something for her. Even if they did it wrong, even if it was clumsy, even if it was by building a room behind her back instead of asking her one question. The last time someone tried to take care of Bryn Holloway instead of letting her take care of everyone else was probably her mother. And her mother had been gone for 13 years. She turned around and looked at Merrick, eyes red but voice steady. "Don't ever investigate me behind my back," she said. and every word was a boundary, a fence, a reminder that she wasn't someone who could be led without knowing the road. If you want to know anything about me, about Peyton, about anything in my life, you ask me, directly. Look me in the eye and ask. That's how ordinary people care about each other. The silence between them was heavy. Then she added, her voice different, not softer but truer, and Peyton will use that room, because my sister needs it, because her chance to walk depends on the equipment in there. Not because you built it, not because I owe you, because she needs it. She walked down the stairs, across the foyer, toward the front door, and when she'd taken 5 steps, she stopped. She didn't turn around. Her back stayed straight, her shoulders still stiff, but when her voice carried through the wide foyer, it held something lighter, something you'd miss if you didn't listen closely. Coffee tomorrow, 7 o'clock. If you make it, bring 2 cups. Garrett Hale came to find Bryn on an afternoon when Merrick wasn't at the mansion. She was sitting in the clinic, documenting Catherine's medication schedule, when she heard a knock at the door, soft but decisive, the kind of knock from a man who wasn't used to asking permission, but was trying. She looked up and saw Garrett in the doorway, one shoulder against the frame, arms folded across his chest. His face still the same unreadable face she'd grown used to over more than a month, but today something was different. His eyes weren't cold, weren't sharp, weren't scanning her like a barcode the way they had on her first day. His eyes looked tired, and somewhere behind the discipline and loyalty, Bryn recognized something she hadn't expected to see in this man. Worry. Garrett stood there in silence for a moment, long enough for Bryn to stop writing and set her pen down, long enough for her to understand he hadn't come to ask about Catherine's health or inspect the clinic, and then he spoke, his voice low and flat, but each word carrying the weight of someone who'd been weighing it for a long time before opening his mouth. You should leave while you still can. Bryn stared at him, not understanding, or understanding and refusing to admit she understood. Garrett didn't explain right away. He stepped into the clinic, closed the door behind him, and for the first time since Bryn arrived at this mansion, he sat down, not on a chair, but on the edge of the exam table, as if standing to say this would make it sound like an order, and sitting would make it sound like advice. Before you, he said, there was another girl. Her name was Mara. Garrett didn't use many words, because Garrett was the kind of man who believed truth didn't need decoration. It only needed to be said. Mara came before Merrick became who he was now, before the Kane Empire swallowed the 22-year-old, who liked drawing houses, and turned him into something else. Mara loved Merrick, and Merrick loved Mara in the only way he knew, by hiding her from his world, building walls around her that he believed were thick enough, high enough, safe enough. But Connor Brennan found her, Garrett said, and his voice didn't change, still flat, still even, but his hand curled into a fist on his knee. Brennan isn't like the others. He doesn't threaten. He promises. And he personally sent Mara's finger in a velvet box to Merrick. Silence. Bryn felt her stomach clamp, felt the little lunch she'd managed to eat rise up into her throat. When Merrick got there, Garrett said, and for the first time his voice cracked, just a small fracture, almost too quiet to catch. But Bryn caught it. It was too late. He stopped, looked down at the clinic floor, the clean white tile Bryn scrubbed every day. Then he looked up, met her eyes, and continued. He keeps her photo in his desk drawer, next to the house design notebook he's had since he was young. 2 things he lost and never got back: the woman he loved, and the man he was supposed to become. Garrett stood, smoothed a crease from his jacket, and his face returned fully to that blank calm, as if the crack in his voice had never happened. I've followed Merrick for 14 years. I was there the night he got the velvet box. I was there in the months after Mara died, when he didn't sleep, didn't eat, didn't speak, only sat staring at the photo in that drawer until the sun came up, then closed the drawer and became Merrick Kane that everyone fears. He paused at the door, his hand clenched tight. I don't want any more photos in that drawer, Miss Holloway. Then he left. The door closed gently, not slammed, because Garrett Hale understood that the most frightening words didn't need loud sound to echo. Bryn sat alone in the clinic, staring at the shut door, and felt Garrett's words stick to her skin like antiseptic, the kind of smell that never fully comes off no matter how many times you wash your hands. Velvet box, finger, too late. The photo in the drawer. You should leave. Garrett was right. She knew he was right with the part of her mind that had kept her alive for 13 years of raising her sister alone. the part that always calculated risk, that always knew when to run, but she didn't leave. The next day, Merrick found her in the garage. He said Catherine was napping and asked if she wanted to see the classic car his father had left behind, a 1968 Ford Mustang, deep blue, sitting under a cover in the corner of a garage as big as a basketball court. He pulled the cover away, and Bryn looked at the car, glossy, beautiful in a way that felt sad, like a relic from a time that had passed. "Do you know how to drive stick?" he asked. Bryn shook her head, and somehow, 10 minutes later, she was in the driver's seat, hands on the wheel, foot on the clutch, and Merrick Kane was in the passenger seat, teaching her how to ease the clutch while giving it gas without stalling. The car lurched. It died. Bryn laughed. Merrick laughed too, soft, almost soundless, but enough for Bryn to realize this was the first time she'd heard him laugh without sarcasm. She started it again. The car rolled forward, slow, trembling, and Merrick placed his hand over hers on the gear shift to guide her from first into second. His hand was warm, dry, much larger than hers, and when his skin touched hers on the shifter, both of them went still. The car kept moving, slow and steady, but no one in the car breathed. Garrett's warning rang in Bryn's head, clear and sharp as a blade. "I don't want any more photos in that drawer." She pulled her hand away, quick, clean, decisive, like pulling away from fire. She turned the engine off, opened the door, stepped out. "That's enough lesson for today," she said, her voice normal to the point of being false, and she walked away without looking back, choosing distance on purpose. Because Bryn Holloway had lost too many people in her life to let herself become the next photo in anyone's drawer. But that night, when she returned to the clinic to check Catherine's evening medications, she saw it. Lying on her desk, right beside the box of medical gloves and her notebook, was an old sketchbook, dark brown leather cover, corners worn, spine slightly loosened. The kind of book that had been opened and folded 1,000 times over years. It had been left open to a page, and on that page was a drawing of a house. Not a mansion or a castle, but a small house, 2 stories, a tiled roof, a front porch with 2 rocking chairs, big windows meant to let light pour into the living room, a maple tree planted along the side. The pencil lines were fine, precise, full of care, the lines of someone who wasn't only designing but dreaming. Bryn sat down, gently, and turned the pages one by one house after another, one dream after another. A house with a balcony facing the sea, a house with a backyard wide enough for children to run, a house with a reading room in the attic under a round window. Every page had small notes in neat handwriting. "Afternoon light falls into the living room at 4. Leave more space between the kitchen and dining room so the person cooking and the person eating can talk. Porch wide enough for 2 people to sit and drink coffee in the morning. Houses drawn for people to live in, to love in, to stay in, not to fear, not to die." Bryn sat in the clinic under the fluorescent light, turning the old design book of a Mafia boss, and thought that the boy who drew these houses, the 12-year-old who told his mother he would build homes for people to live in, that boy was still somewhere inside Merrick Kane, buried deep, locked away, hidden in a drawer beside the photo of the girl he hadn't saved, but still alive. And tonight, he had pulled that sketchbook out, opened it to the page he loved most, and placed it on her desk. Not to explain, not to justify, but to let her see the part of him he had hidden from the whole world. Bryn closed the sketchbook carefully, as if closing a secret, and set it back exactly where it had been. She didn't take it. She didn't need to. She had seen it. The call came at 3 in the afternoon, right in the middle of Bryn rearranging the medication cabinet in the clinic, and trying not to think about the design notebook she'd turned page by page last night, trying not to think about the houses with front porches wide enough for 2 people to drink coffee, trying not to think about that warm hand on the gear shift, and the way she'd pulled her own hand back as if from fire. Her phone vibrated. Peyton's name flashed on the screen, and Bryn answered on instinct, the reflex of a sister who'd trained herself to pick up before the second ring because she was always afraid her little sister would need something and couldn't reach her. But the sound on the other end wasn't Peyton's normal voice. It was shaky, broken, the voice of someone trying to speak while tears swallowed every word. And in a single instant, Bryn's heart dropped into freefall because her brain had been trained over 2 years to hear Peyton's voice tremble and immediately think of the worst. "Bryn," Peyton said, and Bryn's fingers tightened on the edge of the counter until her knuckles went white. Then Peyton laughed. In the middle of tears, in the middle of a trembling voice, her sister laughed, and Bryn heard that laugh the way you hear church bells after a storm. "Bryn, my toes, my toes." I moved them. Bryn didn't speak. Not because she didn't want to, but because her throat locked completely, as if someone had wrapped a hand around her windpipe and refused to let a single sound out. Peyton kept talking, her voice a messy mix of crying and laughing, saying she'd been on the neuromuscular electrical stimulation machine when she felt something in the big toe of her right foot, thought it had to be a hallucination, didn't dare believe it, but the doctor checked and confirmed it. She moved it. The nerve signal was coming back. The therapy was working. This was a wonderful sign. It didn't guarantee she would walk, but the chances had gone up. They'd really gone up. And Peyton kept saying, "Bryn, I can walk again. Do you hear me? I can walk again." Bryn heard her. She heard every word, and every word fell into her chest like rain falling into a desert, soaking in, sinking deep, reaching the driest place she'd kept hidden for 2 years, the fear that her sister would never stand again. She bit her lip, hard enough to taste iron. Then the tears came. And once they started, they didn't stop, because these weren't tears of pain, not tears of anger, not the silent tears she'd shed in sleep on a stranger's shoulder. These were tears of happiness, the kind of tears Bryn Holloway had forgotten the feeling of, had believed her body could no longer make, because she'd cried so much over loss that she'd forgotten people could also cry because something was being given back. She collapsed into a chair in the clinic, surrounded by gauze and antiseptic and boxes of medical gloves, the phone wedged between her shoulder and ear, both hands covering her face, and she cried, soundless, shoulders shaking, chest shaking, her whole body shaking, because for the first time in 2 years she believed Peyton would walk, believed that everything she'd traded away, every boundary she'd crossed, every night she'd lain staring at her nursing certificate on the wall and wondering who she still was. All of it meant something. All of it was worth it. None of it was wasted. She didn't know when Merrick had appeared in the clinic doorway. She only knew that when she finally looked up, eyes red, nose red, face wet and blurred. He was there, one shoulder against the frame, silent, watching her with gray-blue eyes that, for the first time, looked soft. He'd seen her cry in her sleep on his shoulder that first night, when she didn't know who he was. He'd seen her cry from fury when she found the rehab room, when she turned back with eyes on fire. He'd heard Garrett say she cried every night alone in her studio, but this was the first time he'd seen her cry from joy, and the expression on his face then, Bryn would remember forever, was the expression of a man who had no idea what to do. He stood there, and she could see him wrestling with his hands, putting them in his pockets, felt wrong. Crossing his arms felt cold, letting them hang at his sides felt useless. And finally, not from calculation or control, but from something purer, more instinctive, closer to the real man than she'd ever seen, Merrick Kane walked to her and held her. He held her, and Bryn went rigid for 1 second, then 2, because her body had grown used to not being held, had forgotten what it felt like to have someone catch you when you're falling, and then she softened, her shoulder against his chest, her forehead against his throat, and she cried more, into his shirt, crying for Peyton, for a toe, for 2 years, for 13 years, for everything. Then she lifted her head. The space between her eyes and his was only inches, close enough for her to see small brown flecks in the gray-blue she'd never noticed before, close enough to feel his breath on her mouth, and she didn't think. She didn't calculate. She didn't remember Garrett's warning. She didn't remember Mara. She didn't remember the velvet box or the photo in the drawer. She only lifted her face and kissed him. Then she pulled back, fast, startled, like someone who's touched a hot stove without knowing it's on. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. She couldn't finish any of it, because Merrick Kane reached out, gently, touched her wrist, his fingers circling it at the exact spot where, on that first night, she'd unconsciously gripped his wrist in her sleep, and he drew her back in. He kissed her. This time it was him, and he kissed her slowly. So slowly Bryn could feel each moment as its own separate thing, his mouth against hers light, as if he were afraid she might break, his hand at her waist firm but not forcing, his breath trembling, and she realized that Merrick Kane, the man the entire East Coast feared, was kissing her as if she were the most fragile thing he'd ever touched in his life, as if he feared that if he kissed her any harder, she would disappear. When they finally parted, Bryn looked into his eyes and thought of Garrett, of the warning, of the drawer holding a photograph and a notebook, of every reason she should walk out of this door and never come back. Garrett was right. She should leave, but not today. That night, Bryn stayed at the mansion because Catherine wasn't well. Her blood pressure had been fluctuating strangely since the afternoon. The tremor in her hands was worse than usual, and Bryn decided to stay and monitor her overnight, checking every 2 hours, because Parkinson's wasn't a disease that killed with one knife blow. It killed with 1,000 small cuts, and Bryn had seen enough patients at St. Catherine's to know that the nights that felt only slightly off were often the nights when everything could tip if no one was watching. Catherine lay in bed, eyes closed, breathing steady, and Bryn sat in the chair beside her with her notebook on her lap, the bedside lamp casting pale gold shadows on the wall, the whole mansion sunk into the thick silence of 2 a.m. Merrick was upstairs in his office. She knew because when she passed the staircase around midnight to get water, she'd seen lamplight spilling through the crack beneath his door, and she wondered if he ever slept, or if he was like her, the kind of person whose demons woke up late at night and refused to allow rest. She also knew the kiss from this afternoon was still on her mouth, still warm, still soft, still making her touch a fingertip to her lower lip every time she thought of it, and then scold herself for thinking of it too much. But all of it, Catherine's blood pressure, the light under Merrick's door, the lingering taste of that kiss, all of it was erased in a single second by the sound of shattering glass, not glass breaking from wind or an accident. This was glass being struck, being smashed, with force, with intent, and it came from downstairs, the east wing, detonating through the quiet like a bomb in a church. Then gunfire. 1 shot, 2 shots, 3 in rapid succession, and each report was a hammer driven into Bryn's chest, because she'd heard gunshots in movies, on the news. But real gunfire inside an enclosed space was entirely different. It didn't echo. It cracked, hard and short, and after each crack came a brief silence that was more terrifying than the sound itself. The alarm system triggered, sirens tearing the dark apart, red lights strobing down the hallway. The radio on Catherine's bedside table hissed to life, Garrett's voice coming through, and Bryn had never heard Garrett Hale lose his calm until that moment. "Breach! Brennan! Downstairs! Protect the madam!" Catherine opened her eyes. No startle, no panic, no scream. She opened them like a woman used to being woken by gunfire, calm in a way that was frightening, and she looked at Bryn with gray-blue eyes bright in the dark. "Not the first time, sweetheart," she said, her voice steady as stone, while Bryn hauled her upright and pulled a robe around her, Bryn's hands shaking but her movements not, because this was where the emergency nurse took control and shoved fear down into the basement. "I survived 40 years as Mr. Kane's wife. Brennan boys don't amount to much." Bryn got her to her feet and guided her through the door that connected the bedroom to the safe room Garrett had shown her on the first day, a windowless concrete space that locked from the inside, stocked with enough water and supplies for 3 days. Catherine held Bryn's hand as Bryn settled her into the chair inside. Catherine's hand trembling from Parkinson's, not fear, and she looked at Bryn with a look Bryn would never forget. "Go find him." Catherine didn't need to say who him was. Bryn locked the safe room door from the inside for her, showed her how to open it if needed, and ran. She ran upstairs. The stairwell was dark, the alarm lights flashing red, the sharp bite of gunpowder spreading through the air, and Bryn took the steps barefoot because she hadn't had time to grab shoes, running on legs and a heart that was battering her ribs, with one word pounding in her head like a war drum. Merrick, Merrick, Merrick. She found him on the second-floor hallway near his office door. He was slumped against the wall, and Bryn saw blood before she saw him. Blood on the wall, blood on the oak floor, blood on his hand pressed to his left shoulder. 3 shots, left shoulder, the bullet still in there. She knew because there was no exit wound on his back, no blood through. Left side, a graze, a long tear of skin, but not deep, bleeding hard but not dangerous. Left thigh, through and through, blood flowing steadily from the inner thigh, and that was the wound that scared her most, because the femoral artery ran right there, and if the bullet had nicked it, no bandage in the world would be enough. Garrett was at the far end of the hall, gun in hand, covering the stairs, firing back down below, and from far away the wail of police sirens began to rise, faint but coming closer, and Brennan's men pulled back. Bryn heard more glass breaking, an engine roaring, tires shrieking on gravel, and then silence. Silence except Merrick's heavy breathing and the sound of blood dripping onto wood. Garrett moved in, hauled Merrick up, Merrick's weight sagging onto Garrett's shoulder, and the two of them staggered toward the clinic downstairs. Bryn was there before they were. She didn't remember how she got down the steps, didn't remember turning on the lights, opening the cabinets, pulling on gloves, laying instruments out on the steel tray in what order, because emergency instinct had taken full control. 4 years of 14-hour days in St. Catherine's emergency room had turned these motions into reflex, and when Garrett lowered Merrick onto the exam table, Bryn was ready. Tourniquet, cotton, pressure bandages, antiseptic solution, hemostats, everything laid out in order of use. Merrick looked at her, his face pale from blood loss, sweat beading on his forehead, but his eyes were open, alert, and the first thing he said wasn't "save me" or "it hurts." It was "my mother." Bryn met his gaze, her gloved hands already slick with his blood, and she spoke in her emergency nurse voice, the voice she used with panicked patience, steady, clear, unshaking. "She's fine. She's in the safe room. She told me to tell you she survived 40 years so you don't get to die before she does. Now lie down." Merrick didn't lie down. "No hospital," he said, and his voice was weaker than she wanted to hear. "Brennan's watching there. Take me to any hospital in Boston tonight, and you're taking me to a coffin." Bryn bit her lip. She knew he was right, at least in his world. But she also knew the bullet in his shoulder had to come out. The thigh wound had to be checked for vascular damage. And she was a nurse, not a surgeon. "If you don't get surgery, you'll die anyway," she said bluntly. "No sugar, because this wasn't a moment for sugar. I don't have the equipment. I don't have surgical skill. I don't have blood on reserve. You need a doctor." Merrick looked at her. And for the first time in all the times he'd looked at her, since the night she got into the wrong car, since the afternoon he held her in the clinic, since the kiss, this was the first time he looked at her with complete trust, holding nothing back, controlling nothing, only trusting. "Then find a way," he said, and then he added one word she had never heard from him before. One small word, one syllable. But it changed everything. Changed the air in the clinic, changed the distance between them, changed the way she saw him from that moment on. "I trust you." Bryn swallowed, lifted the phone, and called Dr. Franklin Reeves. Dr. Franklin Reeves arrived in 35 minutes, and those 35 minutes were the longest 35 minutes of Bryn Holloway's life. She spent every minute keeping Merrick from bleeding out, pressing bandages into the thigh wound with both hands, changing the dressing on his shoulder when blood soaked through the first layer, checking his pulse, checking his blood pressure, keeping him awake by talking nonstop. Because if Merrick Kane closed his eyes now, she wasn't sure he would open them again. He was losing blood, a lot of it, steadily, and his skin shifted from white to gray with each minute that passed. Garrett stood guard at the clinic door, gun still in his hand, eyes sweeping the hallway. But every few seconds he glanced inside, at Merrick on the exam table, and Bryn realized that Garrett Hale's expressionless face had, for the first time, an expression. Fear. Then she heard a car stop at the gate, fast footsteps on gravel, and Dr. Reeves stepped into the clinic with a surgical bag over his shoulder, and the eyes of a man who'd been dragged out of bed at 3 a.m. for a call he never expected to get. He took in the room. The bullet holes in the hallway wall outside. Bryn, hands covered in blood, scrubs soaked red from chest to thigh, eyes blazing with adrenaline and something far deeper than adrenaline. Merrick on the table, gray-faced, 3 wounds, blood on the floor. Then Dr. Reeves spoke, and his voice was calm enough to be almost funny, the kind of calm only 40 years in operating rooms could forge. "When you called me at midnight saying you needed my help again after I saved your sister, I thought you were going to ask for a letter of recommendation for a specialty program, not for a bullet surgery at 3 a.m. in a mansion." Bryn didn't laugh, not because it wasn't laughable, but because every muscle in her face was busy holding her together, and if she let even one of them go, she would collapse. Dr. Reeves didn't need her to laugh. He opened his surgical bag, washed, pulled on gloves, and started assessing the wounds with the speed and precision of a man who'd saved thousands of lives in a trauma bay before retiring. "The thigh first," he said. The bullet passed through but luckily missed the femoral artery, off by 4 centimeters. 4 centimeters between life and death. It needed firm hemostasis, suturing, and prayer that infection wouldn't set in. The shoulder next. The bullet was still lodged there. It had to come out. Local anesthetic, Surgical tools this clinic was lucky to have. The ribs last, a graze, later. The procedure began and lasted 4 hours. 4 hours with Bryn at Dr. Reeves's side, assisting, handing instruments, suctioning blood, holding gauze, doing everything he asked before he even finished the sentence, because she'd done this 1,000 times at St. Catherine's. Her body knew where to stand, what to hold, where to look, and she let instinct lead while the rest of her, the part that wasn't a nurse, the part that was a woman who had kissed the man lying on this table earlier that day. She locked that part away, shoved it into the darkest room in her mind, and refused to let it open the door. Her eyes never left Merrick. She watched his chest rise and fall, counted breaths, counted the heartbeats on the monitor, and every time the number on the screen dipped, she felt something in her own chest dip with it. Dr. Reeves pulled the bullet from the shoulder, small, deformed, slick with blood, and dropped it into the steel tray with a sharp clink. Bryn would hear in her dreams for nights afterward. He stitched the thigh wound carefully, one stitch at a time, and Bryn wiped blood, replaced gauze, checked pulses, doing it all with hands she forced to stay steady even when they wanted to shake. Then the most dangerous moment came, not when the bullet came out, not when the sutures went in, but in the middle of it, when Merrick had lost too much blood and his body couldn't take it anymore. The monitor beeped, 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 and then a long tone. Flat, a straight line on the screen. Merrick Kane's heart stopped. Dr. Reeves shouted compressions. But Bryn was there before he finished the word. Hands stacked on Merrick's chest, the heel of her palm driving down on his sternum. Steady, hard, rhythmic. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and she counted in her head the way she'd counted hundreds of times over hundreds of patients. But this time was different. This time, with every push, she felt his ribs under her hands, felt his chest sink and recoil, and she thought that if this heart didn't start again, she didn't know what would become of her. 1 second, 2, 3. The screen stayed flat. 4, 5. Dr. Reeves reached for epinephrine. 6, 7. And through a jaw clenched so tight she could hear her teeth grinding, Bryn spoke. Not spoke so much as growled, in a voice she didn't recognize as her own. Don't you die. Do you hear me? You owe me. You owe me the design book you haven't finished drawing. You owe me the driving lesson you didn't finish teaching. You owe me coffee tomorrow, 7 o'clock, 2 cups, you promised. Don't you dare die. The 8th second. Beep, beep, beep. The line jumped, trembling, weak, but there. The heart started again. Bryn didn't cry. Not because she was strong, but because there was no time. Because the procedure wasn't finished. Because Dr. Reeves still needed her right there. Hands steady, eyes sharp. A nurse, and not a woman falling in love with the man on the table. She swallowed the tears back down and kept working. The procedure ended close to 7 in the morning. The first sunlight slipped through the clinic window, falling onto the blood-smeared floor, onto the instrument trays loaded with red gauze, onto Merrick Kane's face lying still on the exam table, eyes closed, skin still gray but his chest still rising and falling. Alive. Dr. Reeves sat down, pulled off his gloves, and for the first time Bryn saw this veteran surgeon's hands shake. The shoulder will need long-term rehab, he said, his voice rough after 4 hours on his feet. The thigh, a few months. The ribs will heal on their own. He was lucky. 4 centimeters farther inward, and the thigh bullet would have severed the femoral artery, and no one could have saved him. He looked at Bryn, at her hands slick with Merrick's blood from fingertips to wrists, at her eyes red raw from 4 hours without blinking, and he didn't say anything more medical. He only said one sentence, soft, as if he were speaking more to himself than to her. His heart stopped for 8 seconds, and you called him back with a list of debts. He stood, patted her shoulder. I've never seen anyone call the dead back by collecting on a debt. Then he picked up his surgical bag, nodded to Garrett at the door. His face returned to expressionless, but his eyes still wet, and walked out, leaving Bryn alone beside the table, staring at the man who was breathing evenly, and for the first time since the sound of glass shattering tore through the night, she let her knees buckle. Bryn didn't remember when she sat down. She only knew that one moment she'd been standing beside the operating table watching Merrick's chest rise and fall, and the next moment she was in the chair with her back against the wall, her hands hanging limp on her thighs, and her body began to shake. Not from cold, not from fear. It was the kind of trembling that comes when a body is finally allowed to stop after adrenaline drains away like a tide pulling back from shore. leaving behind everything it had swept up over the past 4 hours. Fear, exhaustion, the ache in her shoulders from compressions, and something deeper than all of it, something she hadn't dared to name during the procedure, but that was rising now from the bottom of her chest like groundwater forcing its way through a crack. Her hands were stained with Merrick's blood. The blood had dried, darkening from red to brown, clinging to the whorls of her fingerprints, under her nails, into the small folds of her palms, and she stared at her hands like they belonged to a stranger, wondering how these hands had held a man's heart beating for 8 seconds when it had wanted to stop. Dr. Reeves sat down beside her. Not in the doctor's chair across the exam table, but right next to her on the small chair by the wall, his shoulder almost touching hers. And that closeness wasn't the distance between physician and nurse. It was the distance between two people who had just dragged a life back from the edge together. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, gently, not as a question, with no question mark at the end, only a truth he set down between them, the way you set a stone on a table. You love him. Bryn wanted to deny it, wanted to say, no, doctor, I'm a nurse. I did my job. I stopped the bleeding like I've stopped the bleeding for hundreds of other patients. But she couldn't, because Dr. Reeves had been beside her for 4 hours. He had watched her call Merrick back from death with a list of debts. He had heard her voice almost snarl, "Don't you dare die," in a voice no nurse uses with a patient she doesn't love. Lying to a 65-year-old surgeon who had seen every kind of human pain in 40 years of practice would have been like trying to hide the sun with her hand. "I only knew when I saw him covered in blood," Bryn said, and her voice sounded far away, as if she were listening to herself speak from another room. "When I ran up the stairs and saw him slumped against the wall, blood everywhere. In that moment I didn't think about right and wrong, about danger, about what made sense. I only thought one thing: he wasn't allowed to die. Everything else stopped mattering. I don't know if that's love, but I know that if his heart hadn't started again at the 8th second, then a part of me would have stopped too." Dr. Reeves didn't answer right away. He looked toward the table, where Merrick lay now, moved onto a small hospital bed in the clinic, white sheet pulled to his chest. Face gray, but breathing steady, alive, and something in the doctor's gaze softened in a way Bryn had never seen in him. 40 years ago, he said, slow and careful, like a man opening a door he'd kept shut for a long time. "I was standing in an emergency room at 2 a.m, my hands covered in the blood of a woman hurt in a car accident, and I said to a colleague the exact sentence you just said. She wasn't allowed to die. Everything else didn't matter." He paused. "She became my wife. I married her 6 months after that night. 40 years. She died last year. Lung cancer. And I sat beside her bed for the last 3 months holding her hand. And if anyone asks me if I would choose again, I would choose her again every day, even knowing the ending." He turned to Bryn, and his eyes, the eyes of a surgeon who had held a scalpel steady for 40 years, were wet now. "You can't change him, Bryn. Who he is, what his world is, the darkness he carries. You can't change those things, but you can choose to love him with your eyes open, knowing exactly who he is, knowing the price, knowing the danger, and still choosing. But it has to be your choice. Not because you're trapped. Not because you owe him. Not because you have no other road. You have to decide for yourself whether that price is one you can live with." He stood, patted her shoulder again. Light and warm, the kind of touch from a teacher who has taught you all he can and knows the final lesson can't be taught, only learned. Then he picked up his bag, nodded goodbye, and left. His footsteps faded down the hallway, and Bryn sat there alone in the clinic that still smelled of antiseptic and blood, staring at her hands, at the dried blood on her skin, and thinking about 40 years. Thinking about a young doctor in an emergency room at 2 a.m. saying she wasn't allowed to die, then marrying her, living with her for 40 years, losing her, and still choosing her again. Every day, she stood. Her legs wobbled a little from standing too long and sitting too suddenly, but she walked down the hall to the small patient room where Garrett had helped move Merrick after the procedure. She pushed the door open, softly, and stepped inside. Merrick was asleep. His face looked pale beneath the warm yellow glow of the bedside lamp, eyes closed, lips faintly bloodless, the white bandage at his shoulder showing above the edge of the sheet, and his chest rose and fell, steady and slow, the breathing of someone deep in healing sleep. Alive. He was alive. Bryn stood in the doorway and watched him breathe, counting the rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4. Each breath a confirmation that the heart she had pressed with her hands was still working, still pushing blood, still keeping this man in the world. She pulled the small chair to the side of the bed and sat. Then she reached out and took his hand. Large, warm, even after so much blood loss. The hand she'd felt on the gear shift in the garage. The hand she'd taken on the first day. The hand she'd held on the table while checking his pulse. She held it and didn't let go. Outside the window, morning had fully arrived. Autumn light spilling through yellowing maple leaves into the room. And Bryn Holloway, the woman who hadn't slept beside anyone since the night her mother held her hand one last time and closed her eyes 13 years ago. The woman who had learned to sleep alone because she feared that if she slept next to someone, then when she woke, they would be gone. That woman lowered her head to the edge of the bed, her hand still holding Merrick Kane's, and fell asleep. And for the first time in 13 years, she slept beside someone she wasn't afraid would leave her behind. Not because she believed he would stay forever, but because she had chosen. With her eyes open. 3 days. Bryn Holloway didn't leave the patient room for 72 hours. She ate in the room, slept on the chair beside the bed, washed in the small adjoining bathroom, changed Merrick's dressings every 6 hours, checked the sutures, took his temperature, watched for signs of infection, and between checks she sat in the chair reading or video called Peyton in the most normal voice she could manage. "I'm at a friend's place. Don't worry. I'm busy for a few days." And Peyton believed her, or pretended to, because the two of them had lived long enough together to know when not to ask for more. Catherine visited every day, sat for 15 minutes, looked at her son on the bed, and then at Bryn in the chair beside him. And she didn't say much, only took Bryn's hand once, squeezed gently, then had the housekeeper wheel her out. But the look she gave Bryn before she left said more than any words. Garrett brought Bryn coffee every morning, set it on the table by the door, didn't say anything, didn't step inside, only left the coffee and went. And Bryn thought that this was Garrett Hale's version of the closest thing to gratitude he was capable of. On the first day, Merrick ran a low fever, and Bryn stayed up all night watching him. On the second day, the fever eased, the thigh wound began to knit, and Bryn slept 3 hours on the chair. On the third day, in the morning, she was writing down the antibiotic schedule when she heard movement on the bed, sheets whispering, and then a voice, rough from 3 days of not being used, filled the quiet room. "You're still here." Bryn looked up. Merrick's eyes were open, gray-blue and heavy with pain medication, but awake, truly awake, and he was watching her with a look she felt on her skin the way you feel sunlight. He looked her over, the dark circles under her eyes from 3 nights of almost no sleep, the messy knot of hair pinned up with a ballpoint pen because she didn't have a tie, the wrinkled scrubs she'd worn for 72 hours because she didn't want to leave the room long enough to change, and he repeated it, slower, as if it were the most miraculous thing he had ever seen. "You're still here." Bryn set the notebook down, pulled her chair closer, and looked at him with eyes she knew were red and swollen and ugly from lack of sleep. And she didn't care, because he was awake, he was talking, he was alive, and everything else was just detail. "Who's going to change your dressings if I leave?" she said, in her normal voice, her nurse voice, Bryn Holloway's voice when she pretended everything was fine. "Garrett, the man who wraps bandages like he's packaging a burrito. If you want your sutures infected because your dressing was applied with fast food technique, go ahead and send me away." Merrick laughed, then winced because laughing pulled at his abdominal muscles, and his abdominal muscles tugged the rib sutures. But he kept going anyway, and Bryn watched him laugh and grimace on that bed, face gray, shoulder wrapped, thigh wrapped, laughing at her terrible joke. And she thought it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. More beautiful even than the beeping when his heart started again, because a heartbeat only meant he was alive. Laughter meant he wanted to be. Silence arrived after the laughter, but this was a different kind of silence, not heavy, not suffocating, but warm, like a blanket in winter, the kind of silence two people can only have when one of them has nearly died, and both of them know the boundary between having each other and losing each other is thinner than they ever thought. Merrick stared up at the ceiling, and when he began to speak, Bryn understood he wasn't only waking up after 3 days unconscious. He was waking up after 14 years of hiding himself. He told her about Declan, his brother, 4 years older, the real heir to the Kane Empire, the strong one, the one their father planned to hand everything to, and the one who was killed when Merrick was 22. Merrick didn't say who killed him, didn't say how, only that one day Declan was there and the next day he wasn't, and their father stood at Declan's grave and looked at Merrick with eyes that held no tears, only command, and said, "Now it's you." He said he had wanted to be an architect, that the design notebook she'd flipped through lay in his desk drawer for 14 years, and every night he opened it, looked at the houses he'd drawn, then closed it again, because that book wasn't a diary. It was a reminder of the man he should have been, if Declan hadn't died, if his father hadn't forced it, if the world had given him a choice instead of taking everything. Then he spoke about Mara, and this was the first time Bryn heard that name in his own voice. Not through Garrett, not through Catherine, but from his mouth. And the way he said Mara, soft and unsteady, as if speaking it aloud might shatter it, made Bryn understand that even if Garrett had told her about the velvet box and the finger and the too late, Garrett's version was only the bones of the story. The flesh, the blood, the pain lived only in Merrick. "Two things I lost and never got back," he said, eyes on the ceiling but not seeing it. "The design book and Mara, the man I wanted to become, and the woman I wanted to become him with, until you got into my car." Bryn didn't speak for a while. She sat still, letting his words settle, sink in, find a place in her chest alongside all her own pain. Then she told him, not because he asked, but because he had just opened his drawer for her to look inside, and she felt it would be wrong to keep her own drawer closed now. She told him about her mother on a hospital bed, so thin her shoulder bones rose beneath the gown, holding Bryn's hand, 14 years old, sitting by the bed, and speaking in a voice Bryn had to lean close to hear, the way she had whispered, "P, I'm sorry," on his shoulder that first night. "Take care of Peyton for me." 14-year-old Bryn nodded. She never stopped. She told him about her father, the man who disappeared 2 years after her mother died, leaving a note on the kitchen table she never finished reading, because the first line was enough. "I can't do this anymore." Leaving behind stacks of bills, and an empty refrigerator, and a 16-year-old who had to raise an 11-year-old. She told him about the first night she cooked for Peyton, 16 years old. Standing in the tiny studio kitchen the landlord rented cheap out of pity for 2 orphaned sisters, holding a pot, staring at a recipe on her phone, and she burned the rice, blackened it completely, smoke everywhere. Peyton ran out. 11 years old, eyes wide, and the two of them stared at each other, stared at the ruined pot, and she couldn't remember who cried first or who laughed first. But in the end, they sat on the kitchen floor eating dry instant noodles because they were afraid to turn the stove back on, crying and laughing at the same time, and Bryn held her sister and swore she would never leave anyone. Never. "I never leave anyone," she told Merrick, and her voice was calm, steady, no tears, because this wasn't confession. It was declaration. It was the truest core fact about who she was, the thing she would keep even if the world took everything else. "No matter how heavy it gets, no matter how much it hurts, I stay." Merrick looked at her for a long time. He didn't speak. Then he said it, and his voice broke on the last word, only slightly, but enough for Bryn to hear it. "I don't know how to love someone without putting them in danger. Everyone I love, I turn into a target. Declan, Mara, my mother, and now you." Bryn looked at him, the man on the bed with 3 gunshot wounds and 14 years of darkness, and a house design book he never built, and she thought of herself, the 14-year-old who nodded by her dying mother's bed and then spent her whole life taking care of everyone while being terrified down to the bone of anyone taking care of her, because every time someone loved her, they vanished. Her mother vanished. Her father vanished. And she built a wall around herself out of borrowed strength so no one could come close enough to leave her again. "I don't know how to love someone without being afraid they'll disappear," she said. "Every time I care about someone, I start counting down to the day they leave. My mother, my father, every relationship I've ever had. I love and I wait, because I know it will end." She looked at him. He looked at her, and she said, with a small smile, a smile that was sad and warm and true enough to make Merrick Kane's gray-blue eyes brighten, "We fit, 2 broken people." Merrick reached out with the hand that wasn't injured, large and warm, and Bryn took it, and he drew her closer, careful because his shoulder still hurt, and she leaned down, and he lifted his face, and this kiss was different. Not the impulsive kiss of happiness in the clinic, not the kiss she'd panicked away from before he pulled her back. This was the kiss of 2 people who had seen each other's most broken parts, the most painful parts, the ugliest parts, and still chosen slow, warm, eyes closed. And this time, no one pulled away. 2 months passed, and if anyone had asked Bryn Holloway what happiness looked like, she wouldn't have talked about kisses, or vows, or moonlight. She would have talked about a Sunday morning in January, in the Kane Mansion kitchen, with Merrick Kane standing at the stove making fried eggs. He wore a gray t-shirt, barefoot, spatula in hand, flipping the eggs with a wrist that was shockingly nimble for a man who'd taken 3 bullets 2 months earlier. And he could cook, truly cook, not the kind of good that comes from a private chef teaching you, but the kind of good you teach yourself. The kind of good that comes from standing alone in a kitchen on too many nights and making food for yourself because no one else ever did. Bryn sat on the kitchen counter, legs swinging, back against the upper cabinets, phone in hand as she read the news aloud in a fake sports commentator voice she knew would make Merrick laugh. The stock market is down 3%. Experts warn the global economy could slide into recession, and the East Coast's underworld kingpin is flipping eggs with burnt edges. Merrick glanced at her over his shoulder. They aren't burnt. The left edge is burnt. That's called crispy. That's called burnt, Mr. Kane. And he laughed, not the faint half-smile she'd gotten used to, but a real laugh. His whole face in it, creases at the corners of his eyes, his molars showing, and every time he laughed like that, Bryn felt as if she'd opened a door the entire world believed had been locked forever. Peyton sat at the dining table in her wheelchair, both hands wrapped around the glass of orange juice Garrett had placed in front of her, before disappearing somewhere, because Garrett had a strange talent for showing up exactly when needed and vanishing exactly when not, like the politest ghost in the world. Peyton came to the mansion every weekend to do rehab in the room Merrick had built, and over the past 2 months she'd improved so much. The doctor had used the word astonishing in last week's report, and now Peyton sat there, smiling, her skin healthier than it had been when Bryn first started working at the mansion, her eyes brighter, teasing Merrick with the voice of a 22-year-old sister who had accepted her sister's man by turning him into a target for jokes. Catherine sat at the head of the table, spine straight, silver hair pinned neatly, her hands trembling lightly from Parkinson's but her eyes sharp. And when Merrick set the plate of eggs down, she took a bite and frowned with the expression of a queen who'd just been insulted. Salty. Salty again. Who is he cooking for? Seasoning like he's embalming a body. Merrick sighed. Mother, yesterday you said it was bland. Yesterday was yesterday. Today is today. The problem is you never season it right. Peyton choked, laughing on her orange juice. Bryn laughed until her stomach hurt, and Merrick stood in the middle of the kitchen, holding the spatula and looking at the 3 women laughing at him with eyes that, if Bryn looked carefully, if she looked past the calm and control he wore like armor, she could see were wet. This was the moment Bryn would remember forever. Not because it was perfect, but because for the first time in her life, in all 27 years, for the first time she was sitting in a warm kitchen where someone cooked for her, where her sister laughed, where an old woman complained, where a man looked at her with a look she had no word for except home. For the first time she felt something she'd only ever seen in faded photographs. Family. Peyton leaned toward Bryn when Merrick turned his back to grab more toast. Her whisper meant only for the 2 of them. Bryn, he looks at you the way Dad looked at Mom in the old photos, before Dad broke. Bryn looked at her sister and wanted to say something. Wanted to say don't compare. That Dad was a different story. But she couldn't, because Peyton was right, and Bryn knew Peyton was right. And she also knew that before Dad broke was Peyton's way of reminding her that happiness didn't always stay. Catherine watched the 2 sisters whisper, then watched Merrick pouring coffee at the counter, her gaze softening, and she said, so lightly it sounded like she was speaking to herself more than anyone else. First time I've seen my son smile without having to pay someone for it. Then Merrick's phone vibrated. It lay on the counter, the screen lighting up. No name, only a string of numbers, and the buzzing cut across the Sunday breakfast, like a blade slicing through silk. Merrick looked at the screen, set the spatula down. Let me take this. He walked out of the kitchen, down the hall, into his office, and closed the door. Bryn watched him go, and she realized that the way he set the spatula down, gentle, careful, as if he were setting down something far more valuable than a spatula, unsettled her more than any gunshot ever had. He was gone for 5 minutes, 10, 15. When he came back, the eggs were cold, the toast was hard, and Catherine had been wheeled away for her afternoon rest. Peyton was on her phone, Bryn was washing dishes. Merrick stepped in, and Bryn turned to look at him. And she knew. She knew immediately, with the instinct of someone who had read patients' faces long enough to recognize when someone was hiding pain, that something had changed. His eyes were still that same gray blue, but the light inside them was gone. Darker, farther away. As if someone had drawn a curtain behind his eyes, and she was looking into a room with no lamps. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing," he said, and she knew it was a lie. Knew it by the way he didn't meet her eyes. Knew it by the way his hand clenched and then released at his side. Knew it by the way he kissed her forehead and walked away faster than usual, but she didn't press, because she had chosen, with her eyes open, and sometimes having your eyes open meant seeing things you chose not to name out loud. That night, Bryn passed the laundry room. Merrick's hamper sat in the corner, and she saw the white dress shirt he'd worn yesterday afternoon when he went out. The shirt he'd said was for meeting business partners. She picked it up out of habit, because she always checked pockets before tossing clothes into the machine, and then she saw it. A bloodstain. Small, on the right cuff, dried to brown. Bryn was a nurse. She knew the difference between old blood and fresh blood. She knew the difference between blood from a small cut and blood from trauma. And this stain wasn't Merrick's, because his wounds were all on the left and already healed. And this stain sat on the right cuff, the place another person's blood would spatter if he'd been close enough when something happened. She stood in the laundry room holding a white shirt with someone else's blood on it, and she stared, long and hard, until she memorized the shape of the stain behind her eyelids so she would never forget where she was standing. Then she folded the shirt, carefully, neatly, put it in the hamper, didn't ask, walked out of the laundry room, turned off the light, closed the door, and she knew that every time she folded a shirt with blood on it and didn't ask, she was choosing him over the truth. And Bryn wondered how many more shirts she could fold before the truth refused to be folded again. She didn't have to fold another shirt. The truth came for her first. That night Bryn couldn't sleep. Lying in Merrick's room, staring at the ceiling and listening to his breathing beside her. Steady but not deep, the kind of breathing a person has when he's pretending to sleep. And she knew he wasn't asleep either. And she knew it was tied to that phone call in the morning, to the way his eyes went dark when he came back into the kitchen, to the dress shirt with blood on it. But she had chosen not to ask, and he had chosen not to tell, and the two of them lay next to each other in the dark, pretending silence was peace. Then at 2 a.m, Bryn heard soft footsteps on the wood floor, opened her eyes, and saw the space beside her empty. She got up, pulled on a robe, went looking for him, and found him standing on the balcony off his second-floor office, in a Boston winter night, so cold his breath turned to smoke. And he wasn't wearing a coat, wasn't wearing shoes, standing there in a thin t-shirt with bare feet on stone, like a man who didn't feel cold anymore, or didn't care if he did. His face was paper pale under the moonlight, and when he turned to look at her, Bryn realized those gray-blue eyes weren't only as dark as they had been that morning in the kitchen. They carried something she had seen only once before, in the eyes of patients in the emergency room when they were told a loved one hadn't made it. Terror. Not terror for himself, but terror for someone else. "Brennan's men know about you, Bryn." 5 words. 5 words, and the world she'd built over the past 2 months. A world with Sunday breakfasts and burnt-edged eggs and Peyton's laughter and Catherine's sharp complaints. That world cracked like tempered glass, not shattering into dust but splitting into 1,000 fine fractures, still standing, but no longer whole. Merrick told her in a voice that was even, flat, controlled. The voice of a kingpin, not the voice of a man in love, because he needed that voice in order not to collapse. The first incident happened 3 days earlier, the day he took that call over breakfast, and his eyes went dark when he came back into the kitchen. A bouquet of white flowers had been placed outside Bryn's old studio, the studio she barely lived in anymore, but still kept leased because it was the only address in her name. White lilies, the kind used at funerals, tied with a black ribbon, and clipped into the bouquet was a small card, the handwriting neat, polite in a way that was terrifying. Funeral flowers, save time by preparing early, no signature. No signature needed. Merrick knew that handwriting. He'd seen it once before, years ago, on the small card attached to the velvet box that held Mara's finger. The second incident came the next day, and this was the one that left Merrick Kane on the balcony at 2 a.m. with a face gone white. A brown envelope, no stamp, no return address, had been set on the mansion's front steps. which meant someone had gotten close enough to his home to leave it there without security noticing, or noticing too late to stop it. Inside the envelope was a photograph. Bryn held it with shaking hands and saw Peyton, her sister in her wheelchair at the rehab center, practicing with the parallel bars, sweating, smiling. That bright smile Bryn knew, the smile Peyton wore whenever she managed one more tiny movement, whenever her body listened, whenever hope climbed one notch higher. But behind Peyton, in the corner of the photo, sitting in the waiting area, was a man. His face was clear. His eyes looked straight into the camera, smiling. That smile wasn't normal. It was the smile of someone who wanted her to know he was there, wanted her to know he had been sitting a few steps from her sister while her sister practiced walking and no one knew, wanted her to know he could touch Peyton anytime he wanted. On the back of the photo, in the same handwriting as the funeral card, were the words, a single line, neat and calm. A wheelchair won't help her run any faster. Bryn didn't cry. She wanted to. She felt tears rise up to the back of her throat, but they wouldn't fall, because her body had switched into a different setting. The setting she'd activated the night Brennan attacked the mansion. The emergency setting, the survival setting, the setting where tears were a luxury she wasn't allowed to afford. She looked at Merrick. Connor Brennan, he said, and the name left his mouth heavy as stone. He's the one who sent me Mara's finger in a velvet box with his own hands. He doesn't threaten, Bryn. He doesn't bluff. He promises, and he keeps his promises. Every time. His voice broke on every time, only slightly, almost inaudible, but Bryn heard it, and she understood that in that moment, Merrick Kane wasn't standing on a balcony looking out over Boston. He was standing in the past, staring down at a velvet box, staring at what was inside it, living again the night he arrived, and it was too late. Merrick moved immediately that same night. Garrett drove to the rehab center before dawn and brought Peyton back to the mansion. Peyton didn't ask many questions, because when Garrett Hale shows up at 4 a.m. with a face cold as stone and says, "You need to leave now," even Peyton, the most optimistic 22-year-old Bryn had ever known, understands this isn't a normal weekend visit. Mansion security tripled. More guards at the gate, in the gardens, in the halls. Merrick made call after call, his words short, clipped, cold. The kingpin voice Bryn had almost forgotten in 2 months of Sunday breakfasts and fried eggs. Then the final message came, on the second day after Peyton returned to the mansion, from Connor Brennan, not delivered through flowers or an envelope, but sent straight to Merrick's private phone, from a number only a handful of people knew. And the fact that Brennan had that number was a message all by itself, that he could reach anything he wanted. 7 days. Hand over the Northern Territory, or the next bouquet won't be fake flowers. Merrick read it to Bryn in a voice with no emotion, the voice of a man who had shut everything inside himself off so he could stay standing. Then he looked at her, and in the morning light slipping through his office windows, she saw his face and remembered the first night, the night she climbed into the wrong car, the night she slept on his shoulder, when she had thought he was the most dangerous man she'd ever met. But now, watching him stand there with Peyton's photograph in his hand and a 7-day clock beginning to count down in his mind, she understood that Merrick Kane wasn't the most dangerous man in this story, and the most dangerous man was counting the days one by one. The third night on the 7-day clock, and the Kane mansion no longer felt like the house Bryn had started to call home over the past 2 months. There were guards in the corridors, the windows stayed sealed shut, the curtains drawn. The light inside the house always sallow because no one dared open the drapes in daylight, and the silence that covered the rooms wasn't peaceful silence. It was the silence of people holding their breath, waiting for the blast. Peyton hadn't said much since she'd been brought back to the mansion, and that scared Bryn more than any funeral bouquet or photograph ever could, because Peyton always talked, always laughed, always found a way to turn anything into a joke. That was how her sister had survived 2 years in a wheelchair. When Peyton went quiet, it meant she understood that this time there was nothing to joke about. Every night Bryn took Peyton into the safe room, the windowless concrete box where she'd taken Catherine the night Brennan attacked, and every night she stayed with her sister until Peyton fell asleep, then left. But on the third night, Peyton didn't sleep. She sat on the bed with her back against the wall, legs stretched beneath the blanket. Those legs that 2 months earlier had begun to move a toe, had begun to give her hope, and now lay inside a concrete room because a strange man had been sitting behind her smiling at the rehab center, and she'd never known. Bryn sat beside her and didn't know what to say. Because for 13 years she had always known what to say to Peyton, always found an answer, always found comfort, always had a way to turn "it's going to be okay" into something believable, even when they both knew it was a lie. Tonight she couldn't find a single word. Then Peyton took her hand, and her sister's hand was warmer than Bryn's, warmer and steadier, and Peyton asked in a voice calmer than Bryn expected, calmer than any 22-year-old girl sitting in a concrete room had a right to be. "Bryn, can he protect us?" Bryn opened her mouth. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to say Merrick Kane is the East Coast kingpin. He has an empire. Men, guns, Garrett, everything. She wanted to say he can protect us. Of course he can. He has protected his mother for years. He will protect us. But she couldn't. Because of Mara. Because of the velvet box. Because of when he got there, it was too late. And Bryn was a nurse. She didn't lie to patients about prognosis. She didn't promise you'll be fine when she didn't know it would be. She didn't lie to her sister. Silence stretched for 3 seconds, 4 seconds. Long enough for Peyton to understand her sister didn't have an answer. And long enough for Peyton to do what she'd done her whole life. Reverse the roles. "It's okay," Peyton said, squeezing Bryn's hand gently and smiling. A small smile, sad but real. "You can protect us. You always protect me." And that sentence, from the mouth of a 22-year-old sister in a wheelchair in a concrete room, hit Bryn's chest harder than any bullet, because Peyton didn't put her faith in a kingpin, or an empire, or weapons. Peyton put her faith in her sister, in Bryn, in the 16-year-old girl who had raised her on instant noodles and burnt rice. That faith weighed more than the world. Bryn kissed Peyton's forehead, pulled the blanket up, waited until her sister's breathing evened out, then stepped out of the safe room, closed the door, and went to find Merrick. She didn't find him in the bedroom, not on the balcony, not in the kitchen. She found him in his office, and she knew before she opened the door that something was wrong, because there was no lamp glow spilling from under it the way there was most nights, only darkness, and the smell of whiskey. She pushed the door open. The room was dark, lit only by moonlight coming through a window someone had pulled the curtain away from, and in that moonlight, she saw Merrick sitting on the floor with his back against the desk, surrounded by shards of glass. A whiskey tumbler lay shattered, fragments scattered everywhere, amber liquid spreading across the oak, and Merrick's right hand was bleeding. Not much, but bright, fresh, running from his palm down to his wrist, dripping onto his trouser leg. And he didn't notice, or didn't care, because he was holding a piece of glass like he couldn't feel it cutting. On the desk above him, Bryn saw 2 photographs lying side by side. The photo Brennan had sent. Peyton smiling in her wheelchair with that strange man sitting behind her. And beside it, older, smaller, the corners curled, the color faded. A photograph of a girl Bryn had never seen but knew instantly. Mara. 2 pictures. 2 women. The same script, the same fear. And the same man sitting on the floor amid blood and broken glass because he couldn't protect them. "You have to leave," Merrick said, not looking at her. Eyes on the floor, on the glass, on the blood, anywhere but her face. "Take Peyton. Get out of Boston. Get out of my life. Forget me." His voice was flat, cold, the voice of a kingpin issuing orders, but Bryn had been with him long enough to hear the fracture beneath it, to hear the way each word trembled at the end, to hear the voice of a man trying to shove away the most precious thing he had, because he was terrified it would be destroyed in his hands. "Are you ordering me?" she asked, and her voice wasn't gentle, wasn't soothing, but sharp, hard, because she knew if she softened now, he would think he was right, think pushing her away was protecting her. "I think repeating the same old mistake by taking the decision from her was love." "I'm saving you," he said. "The last time you saved someone," Bryn said. And she knew it would hurt, knew it would cut, knew it was cruel, but she said it because she needed him to hear it, needed him to look straight at the truth instead of running from it into whiskey and shattered glass. "The last time you saved someone, Mara, did she survive?" Silence. Silence long enough for Bryn to hear his blood drip from his hand to the floor, to hear the wind outside the window, to hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then Merrick Kane cried, not the quiet kind of crying where tears slide down unnoticed, not the kind a man uses when he's practiced hiding pain. His shoulders shook, his jaw clenched, and tears ran down the face the entire East Coast feared, ran over high cheekbones and a sharp jawline, fell into his collar, and he wiped them with the back of his blood-smeared hand, wiping with force and anger. wiping as if they were an enemy. Because Merrick Kane had spent 14 years in a world where tears were weakness, and weakness meant death, and he hated himself for crying more than he hated any rival. "I keep the design book," he said, and his voice broke, truly broke. Not a small fracture now, but a collapse. "Because every night I open it and look at the houses I drew for people to live in, and I wonder when the boy who drew them died. The 12-year-old who told his mother he'd build homes for people to live in. When did that boy die? When Declan was killed. When my father forced me. When Mara." He couldn't finish the sentence. "And tonight," he said, finally lifting his eyes to her, and those gray-blue eyes were soaked and red and wrecked. "I looked at the picture of your sister beside Mara's picture, the same script, the same man behind it. And I know. That boy died the moment he pulled you into his life. The boy who drew houses didn't die because of Declan or my father or the Empire. He died because he never learned one thing. Everything he touches, he destroys." Bryn dropped to her knees, not because she was weak, not because she was afraid, but the way she knelt beside a patient's bed in the emergency room, because the man in front of her was bleeding, and she was the one who stopped the bleeding. Her knees hit the wood floor among the broken glass. She felt a small shard slice through her scrubs into skin. But she didn't flinch, didn't look down, only looked at Merrick Kane's right hand, clenched around a jagged piece of glass, while blood ran between his fingers, and he either didn't know or didn't care. She reached for him, gently, slowly, the way she approached panicked patients, never fast, never sudden, always letting them see her hand before she touched them. She set her fingertips on the back of his hand, pressed lightly, and then opened his fingers one by one away from the glass. One finger at a time. Index, middle, ring, pinky. The shard dropped to the floor with a small metallic clink, and his palm was exposed, red and split, blood still flowing from a cut straight across the center. And Bryn looked at it with a nurse's eyes, a fast assessment, not deep enough to reach tendon, not a suturing job, but it needed washing, needed wrapping, needed care from someone who cared. She pushed up her scrub sleeve, the sleeve she'd worn all night because there hadn't been time to change, a sleeve that would turn white no longer, and she wiped his hand with the fabric, gently, wiping away each streak of blood. Because she was a nurse, she healed. That was what she knew how to do best in this world. And she healed not only wounds on skin, but wounds no gauze could ever cover. Merrick watched her wipe his blood with her scrub sleeve, and he didn't speak, only watched. Watched her hands hold his with a carefulness he couldn't remember anyone ever giving him, watched her face bent close to his hand, her brow drawn tight with concentration, her eyes checking the cut by pure professional instinct, even as she knelt on a floor of shattered glass at 2 a.m. in the office of a Mafia kingpin who had been crying. When she finished, she still held his hand in hers, and she lifted her head and looked straight into his eyes. His eyes were red, wet, broken, those gray-blue eyes she had seen cold as a winter sea, soft as autumn sun, bright with laughter and dark with fear, and now they looked at her with the gaze of a man who had let go, who had accepted he couldn't save anyone, who was ready to lose again, because losing was all he knew. And Bryn Holloway, the 14-year-old girl who had nodded beside her dying mother's bed, the 16-year-old girl who had burned rice and then held her sister on a kitchen floor and cried, the 27-year-old woman who had climbed into the wrong car and slept on a kingpin's shoulder and loved him with her eyes open, looked into that wrecked gaze and spoke. "I lost my mother because we didn't have the money to treat her. I was 14. I held her hand and watched her close her eyes, and I knew that if my family had had enough money, she wouldn't have died that year. I lost my father because he was too cowardly to stay, too weak to carry it, and he walked out and left 2 kids with an empty fridge and a stack of overdue bills because he couldn't take it anymore. But I could. I had to, because Peyton needed me. I almost lost my sister to fate, to a car going too fast on an ordinary day, and I spent 2 years watching my sister sit in a wheelchair and asking myself every night if I had enough strength to pull Peyton to the other side." She stopped, drew in a breath, tightened her grip on his hand. "I know what loss is, Merrick. I live inside it every day. I eat breakfast with it. I go to work with it. I sleep next to it. It's my oldest friend. And I'm telling you this. I'm not losing you. Not today. Not because of Brennan. And absolutely not because you decide for me that I should be scared, that I should run, that I'm not strong enough to stand beside you in the dark. I've decided for myself, since I was 16, Since the night my father left and I stood in the kitchen staring at burnt rice and swore no one would ever decide for me again. You don't get to take that from me. No one gets to. Merrick looked at her, and the tears kept coming. But he didn't wipe them away, didn't swipe at them like enemies anymore. He just let them fall, and maybe this was the first time in 14 years he allowed himself to cry without calling the tears an enemy. Then what am I supposed to do? He asked, his voice hoarse, broken, small, the voice of a 12-year-old boy who loved drawing houses more than the voice of the East Coast kingpin, and Bryn thought this might be the first time Merrick Kane had asked anyone what he should do, instead of deciding for everyone. You fight, she said, and her voice wasn't gentle, wasn't soothing, wasn't comforting. It was steady, solid, the kind of ground a man could stand on. Not alone this time with me. You find a way to get all of us out. Me, Peyton, Catherine, you, all of us. You don't choose between protecting me and protecting yourself. You find a way to protect both. She glanced at the desk, at the two photographs lying side by side, Peyton and Mara, then looked back at him. And if you have to burn down everything you built, the empire, the territory, the power, all of it, then burn it. Because that's not you. You're the one who drew the houses in that book, Merrick. And you haven't built them. You never built them. For 14 years, you opened that book every night and shut it again because you thought that boy was dead. But he isn't dead. He's here. He's still here. And I want to see you, build something real. With your own hands, not with blood. Merrick stared at her. For a long time, he looked at her kneeling on a floor of glass, knees surely scraped where shards had bitten through cloth, hands smeared with his blood, scrub sleeves stained red, and her eyes burning, not with tears, not with fear, but with love, with faith, with a strength Merrick Kane could command in 1,000 men and still never manufacture, the kind of strength that belongs only to someone who has lost everything and still chooses to stand up every morning. She didn't need him to save her. She never had. She got into his car because she was exhausted, stayed because of Peyton, and loved him because she chose to. And now she was kneeling on his floor amid broken glass and blood, not so he could save her, but so she could save him. He reached for her, the hand she had just wiped clean, and pulled her into his chest, held her carefully because his left shoulder still hadn't fully healed, and held her on a floor, slick with whiskey and glittering with glass. And she held him back, tight, the way she held Peyton on blackout nights when her sister was afraid of the dark, holding with the full force of someone who never leaves anyone behind. He whispered into her hair, his voice rough, trembling, but for the first time in 3 nights, it wasn't despair. It was something else, something Bryn would recognize later as resolve. There's a way, but the price is huge. Bryn didn't pull back, didn't ask what the price was, didn't weigh it. She only said, her voice steady as bedrock, give everything, not to Brennan, to the FBI. And in the darkness of the office, among glass and blood and tears and the smell of whiskey, Merrick Kane saw a door out for the first time in 14 years. Not a door of empire, not a door of power, but the door of a small 2-story house with a front porch wide enough for 2 rocking chairs, the house he had drawn in that old design notebook when he was 12 and believed he would build homes for people to live in. And for the first time, he believed he might actually build it. Merrick didn't speak right away. He sat there on the floor with Bryn in his arms, amid broken glass and blood, and the silence lasted long enough for her to hear his heartbeat under his chest. Steady, slow, the heartbeat of a man making the biggest decision of his life. Then he let her go, gently, stood, crossed to the desk, and opened the drawer Garrett had told her about, the drawer that held Mara's photo and the design notebook, the 2 things he'd lost and never got back. But he didn't take Mara's picture, and he didn't take the notebook. He took something else, tucked farther back, down at the very bottom, hidden beneath the drawer liner, a small old phone, the kind with a flip lid that nobody used anymore, and a business card. He set both on the desk beside the 2 photographs of Peyton and Mara, and looked at Bryn. Years ago, he said, his voice calm again, but a different kind of calm. Not the calm of control, but the calm of a choice already made. When I first took over the Kane Empire, I set up a secret channel. With the FBI. He paused and let her absorb it, and Bryn stared at the flip phone on the desk, thinking about how many years that tiny thing had sat in that drawer, waiting. Like a timed charge, the man who planted it didn't know when he'd have to ignite. Only that one day he would. I always knew I'd need an exit, Merrick said. I just didn't know when. And I didn't know the exit would come in the shape of a nurse who got in the wrong car and slept on my shoulder at midnight. He explained the deal, and he explained it in a kingpin's voice. Clear, logical, point by point, because this was the last negotiation of his life, and he needed Bryn to understand everything before she agreed. He would give the FBI all the Kane organization's information. Everything. No holding back. Shipping routes, bank accounts in 6 countries, contact lists, infrastructure, and most of all, the full intelligence on the Brennan organization Kane had collected over years of war, enough for the FBI to bring down both empires at once. In return, safety for Bryn, for Peyton, and for Catherine through the Federal Witness Protection Program. Immunity for Merrick, contingent on full cooperation. New identities. A new life somewhere nobody knew the name, Kane. Do you understand what that price means? Bryn asked, not because she wanted him to stop, but because she needed him to say it, needed him to hear himself say it, because a decision that large couldn't be made in silence. Merrick looked at her, then down at the desk, at the flip phone, at the 2 photographs, at the design notebook with its corner still peeking from the open drawer. My brother died for the thing I'm about to destroy, he said, his voice steady, unbroken, but each word heavy as lead. Declan died protecting the Kane Empire. My father handed it to me because Declan was gone to take it. And I held it for 14 years, not because I wanted it, but because I thought destroying it would betray my brother, would make his death meaningless. He paused. But Declan didn't die for an empire. Declan died for violence. And keeping the empire isn't honoring him. It's keeping the violence alive. He looked back at Bryn. The people who believe in me will call me a traitor. Some will go to prison. I'll lose everything I built for 14 years. But you're safe. Peyton is safe. My mother is safe. And I, his eyes flicked to the design notebook, I get to build again, with my own hands. This time, build something worth living for. 2 days later, everything moved so fast, Bryn felt like she was standing in the eye of a storm, quiet in the center, while the world spun itself apart around her. Merrick dialed a number on the flip phone, said 3 sentences, and snapped it shut. 6 hours later, 2 men in suits came to the estate, sat with Merrick in his office for 4 hours, and carried USB drives and document boxes Merrick had prepared years ago, waiting for this exact day. A lawyer arrived. Papers were signed. The agreement became official. 48 hours to leave Boston. Merrick arranged everything with the precise, almost terrifying efficiency of a man who had been planning this moment longer than anyone knew, and Bryn realized the same ability he'd used to build an empire was the ability he used to destroy it. Only this time he was destroying it, so he could rebuild. The last night in the estate, Garrett found Merrick in the garage beside the dark blue 1968 Ford Mustang. The car Merrick had taught Bryn to drive stick in. The car his hand had covered hers on the shifter, the car that would stay behind when they left. Bryn stood in the garage doorway and didn't step in, because she understood this goodbye didn't belong to her. She only watched from a distance. Watched 2 men stand beside an old car under the garage's pale yellow lights, and she could hear them, not because they spoke loudly, but because the garage was quiet, and every sound echoed off concrete. 14 years, Merrick, Garrett said, and it was the first time Bryn had heard Garrett Hale call him by his name instead of Sir or Mr. Kane, and that alone made her eyes burn. I know, Merrick said, and I'm sorry. Silence. Long. Heavy. Garrett stood there, hands at his sides, wearing the blank face Bryn had seen for months, and she waited for him to say something cold, something restrained, something that sounded like Garrett. But Garrett did something she didn't expect. He stayed quiet long enough that Bryn thought he wouldn't speak at all. And then he did, and his voice was normal, flat, even, but under the surface, in the place only someone who truly listened could reach, it trembled. Don't be sorry. She deserved it. You deserved it too. A pause. It's just that this time you're leaving without me driving. Then Garrett smiled, and Bryn, braced in the doorway with her hand on the frame, witnessed something she had never seen in all the months she'd lived in the Kane estate. Garrett Hale smiled. Not a big smile, not a full-face laugh. Only the right corner of his mouth lifting, his eyes narrowing a fraction. But it was a smile, a real one, and it made his stone face look 10 years younger, like a normal man, instead of a loyal machine. "You're a terrible driver," Garrett said, and Merrick laughed, soft, sad, then stepped forward and hugged him. A short, tight, man's hug, the kind between two people who have walked together through 14 years of darkness and bullets and blood and sleepless nights, the kind that doesn't need more words because everything that matters is already inside the pressure of their arms. Then they let go. Garrett stepped back one pace. Merrick stepped back one pace. No one said anything else. Garrett turned and walked past Bryn at the garage door, and as he passed he stopped for a single second, didn't look at her, kept his eyes straight ahead, and said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear, "Take care of him." Then he walked on, footsteps, steady on gravel, back straight, shoulders wide, disappearing into the hallway, shadows the way he had disappeared into shadows for 14 years. Silent, loyal, and never once asking anyone to say thank you. 4 a.m. Dawn hadn't arrived yet, but the sky was already beginning to pale along the eastern horizon. That muted gray-violet color that signals darkness is ending while light isn't ready to take its place. A suspended moment between two worlds, and Bryn thought there was no more fitting time to say goodbye to this house. The Kane mansion was quiet for the last time. The kind of quiet that belongs to a place about to be abandoned. Everything still in its place while the soul slowly withdraws, and Bryn walked the familiar hallway she knew down to every creaking step and every window that caught the sun at a certain angle, walking it one final time, touching the wall one final time, feeling the house touch her back with the leftover warmth of all the months she had lived here. Catherine was waiting in the living room, seated in the deep green velvet armchair where she had sat on the first day, looking Bryn up and down and asking, "Are you the girl who slept in my son's car?" Her back still straight, her silver hair still neatly pinned, her gray-blue eyes identical to her son's still bright, despite it being 4 a.m, and despite the fact that she had been awake all night to say these words. Catherine Kane wouldn't be leaving with them. Not yet, at least. She would remain under Federal Bureau of Investigation protection at a separate, safe location, because she was 68 years old, Parkinson's disease, stage 2, and the journey Merrick and Bryn were about to take required a speed her body could no longer give. They would see each other again later, when everything was stable, when Brennan was arrested, when the new identities were secure. But later was a word people in this world knew better than to trust completely. She took Bryn's hand. It trembled from Parkinson's, but the grip was firm. Firmer than Bryn thought a 68-year-old woman could manage, because Catherine Kane was a woman who had lived 40 years in the dark beside her husband and then beside her son without ever breaking, and that strength didn't live in muscle, but somewhere far deeper. "Take care of him for me," she said, her voice steady, not crying, because Catherine Kane wasn't the kind of woman who cried at goodbyes. She was the kind who folded everything inward and cried after the door was closed and no one could see, exactly like her son. He pretends to be strong, but he's fragile, just like his father, just like his brother. Kane men are better at pretending to be strong than anyone I know, and they break easier than anyone I know. She paused, looking at Bryn with the same gaze Bryn had seen on the first day, a gaze that knew everything, saw through everything, and loved anyway. "And you," she said, her voice softer now, warmer, the voice of a mother speaking to a daughter she hadn't born but had chosen. "You're stronger than you think. I knew it the first night you walked into this house and dared to argue with my son, set conditions, looked him straight in the eye, and told him that if he lied to you, you would disappear. I was in the other room. I heard everything, and I thought, this girl, this thin girl with dark circles under her eyes in wrinkled scrubs, she's going to save my son." Tears rose in Bryn's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Not because she was strong, but because if she cried, then Catherine would cry. And if Catherine cried, then Merrick wouldn't be able to walk out that door. Catherine turned to Merrick, standing behind Bryn, silent, his gray-blue eyes wet as he tried to hide it by staring out the window, unsuccessfully, not from anyone in that room. "Go, my son," she said, and now her voice trembled, just for a beat, one single beat, before steadying again. "Build something beautiful. I want to see you build a real home, not on paper but in the world, with brick and wood and your own hands, before I close my eyes. You owe me at least one house, Merrick Kane." Merrick stepped forward, dropped to his knees beside her chair the way Bryn had once knelt before him on a floor scattered with broken glass, and he held his mother. He held her for a long time, longer than any embrace Bryn had ever seen him give anyone. His head rested on her shoulder, and she patted his back, gently, rhythmically, like soothing a child, the kind of touch Bryn recognized instantly, because she had soothed Peyton that way for thousands of nights, the kind of touch only someone who had cared for another since childhood could know. And Catherine Kane, the queen who had stepped down, was patting the back of the man who ruled the eastern seaboard like he was a 12-year-old boy who loved drawing houses, the boy she had never stopped seeing inside her son. Then Merrick stood, kissed her forehead, and Catherine held his hand for one more second before letting go. And the way she released him, finger by finger, slowly, like someone trying to memorize the feeling one last time, forced Bryn to turn away because she couldn't bear it anymore. They went downstairs, and Peyton was waiting in the rehabilitation room, not seated in a wheelchair. Standing. Peyton was standing with the help of a walker, both hands gripping the metal bars, her legs shaking slightly but planted on the floor, and she stood there, truly standing, on legs that 2 months earlier doctors had said had only a 40% chance of walking again. The legs Bryn had sold her soul to the dark to save, now holding her sister upright in the room Merrick Kane had built behind her back, and been scolded for not asking first. Bryn stopped at the doorway, and everything she had held in all night, through saying goodbye to Catherine, through Merrick's embrace with his mother, rose all at once at the sight of her sister standing. Peyton looked at her, her eyes wet too, but her smile radiant, the same victorious smile Bryn remembered from the photo sent by the rehab center. "Are you going far?" Peyton asked, her voice calm, gentle, as if her sister were leaving on a short work trip, rather than disappearing into the federal witness protection program. Bryn walked over, stood in front of her sister, looked down at Peyton's feet touching the ground, then up into her eyes, and she smiled even though her lips trembled. "Yeah, Pay, but I'll call every day, every day." She emphasized each word, because this was a promise, and Bryn Holloway never broke promises to her sister. Peyton nodded, then glanced toward Merrick, standing at the doorway, leaning against the frame, hands in his pockets, watching the sisters with an expression he was trying to keep composed but failing to hide, and Peyton asked, her voice more serious than Bryn had ever heard her speak, "Does he deserve it, sis?" Bryn looked at her sister, at Peyton standing there with a walker, the sister she had raised since she was 16, the sister whose hospital bills had been $4,200 a month, the sister she had cried over night after night beside her nursing diploma and the words, "First, do no harm," the sister who was now standing on her own legs. And Bryn thought of the night she took the wrong car, of Merrick's warm shoulder beneath her head, of the best 50 minutes of sleep she had had in 13 years, of coffee beside blood-soaked bandages, of the open design notebook turned to his favorite page, of the night he almost died, and she called him back with a list of debts, and she said, "The person who lets me sleep when everything collapses, I think that person deserves it." Peyton studied her for a long moment with eyes that had grown up faster than 22 years should allow. Then she smiled. That mischievous smile Bryn loved more than anything. "You still suck at choosing Uber drivers." Bryn laughed, a sound bursting through tears sliding down her cheeks, laughing because only Peyton, only this sister, could turn the heaviest moment into laughter, and she said, her voice thick but steady, "But I'm good at choosing people." They hugged, and Bryn held back at first because Peyton was standing with a walker, and she was afraid of knocking her off balance. But Peyton hugged her tight enough that Bryn felt her sister's racing heartbeat through the fabric, and she knew Peyton was afraid of her leaving, afraid like every time someone walked out of their lives. But Peyton didn't say she was afraid because Peyton was Bryn Holloway's sister, and Holloway sisters didn't say afraid. They hugged harder, then let go, then smiled, then kept walking. Bryn kissed Peyton's forehead, then turned away. Merrick was waiting in the hallway, holding the single bag they carried. Inside it, the design notebook, the new identities, the future. She took his hand, and together they walked out the front doors of the Kane mansion for the last time, stepping into the dawn rising over eastern Boston, the sky shifting from gray-violet to soft orange-pink, and Bryn didn't look back, because her mother had taught her long ago that when you walk forward. A silver-gray 1992 pickup truck was waiting at the end of the narrow service road behind the mansion, arranged by the Federal Bureau of Investigation the night before. Not the glossy black Cadillac CT6, not the deep blue '68 Mustang in the garage, just an old, ordinary vehicle, the kind no one looks at twice on the highway, the kind driven by ordinary people, living ordinary lives. and Bryn thought there was no vehicle more beautiful than this one. In the bed, a few bags, so few it was almost painful. Their entire new life packed into 3 duffel bags, a handful of clothes, identification papers with different names, and a dark brown leather-designed notebook with worn corners tucked inside Merrick's backpack, like the only thing he was carrying from the life he'd left behind. Merrick slid into the driver's seat, rested his hands on the steering wheel, and didn't start the engine right away. He sat there, staring at the road ahead, the small road that fed into the interstate, that would lead out of Boston, out of Massachusetts, out of everything he had ever known, ever built, ever been, and he said, his voice quiet, not sad, not glad, only true, "I've never driven away without a plan to come back." Bryn sat in the passenger seat, watching him, watching his hands on the wheel, the same hands she had wiped blood from on a floor littered with broken glass, the same hands she had held in a hospital bed after a 4-hour surgery, the same hands that had guided hers on the gear shift in the garage when he taught her how to drive, and she reached out and placed her hand on top of his, gentle, warm, the same way he had placed her hand on the Mustang's gear shift that day, when everything was just beginning, when she still pulled back because Garrett's warning rang in her head, when she still feared becoming the next photograph in a drawer. But this time she didn't pull away. She left her hand on his and said, "Then this time we're not coming back. We keep going." Merrick looked down at her hand over his, then started the engine. The truck rolled forward, slow, onto the narrow road, turned right, merged onto the highway, and Boston began to shrink in the rearview mirror. The city where he was born, where he grew up, where he lost his brother, lost his father, lost Mara, lost himself. The city he had ruled from the shadows for 14 years, an empire built from blood and fear and sleepless nights, all of it fitting inside that small glass rectangle behind them, and getting smaller, smaller, until Boston's skyline was only a faint gray smear, and then vanished completely around a bend. Merrick didn't look in the rearview mirror. He looked forward, at the long straight highway running west, and for the first time in 14 years, he drove without scanning the mirror for enemies, without checking for a tail, without mapping the next battle. He just drove, into the light rising ahead. 1 hour on the road. 2. The morning brightened, shifting from orange-pink to pale gold, and then to a wide blue, the January sky cold but clear, and the highway unspooled before them like a promise. No one spoke out loud, but both of them understood. Then Merrick glanced to his right, and he stopped breathing. Bryn was asleep. Her head had fallen onto his shoulder, her hair spilling across his arm, her breathing soft and even, her face peaceful, exactly like the first night, inside the Cadillac CT6, when she had climbed into the wrong car from sheer exhaustion after a 14-hour shift, announced that she had 90 seconds before she passed out, and then fell asleep on the shoulder of a Mafia boss, without knowing he was a Mafia boss. Exactly the same loose hair, the same tilt of her head onto his shoulder, the same light breathing he had to strain to hear. But different. Different because that night she cried in her sleep, tears sliding down her cheeks and soaking into his suit, and she whispered her sister's name in a voice full of apology for failing to save her. Now she wasn't crying. Now there was a smile on her lips. Small, soft, almost invisible, unless you looked closely. But Merrick looked closely, because he had always looked closely at her, from the first night when he watched her tears on his shoulder and decided to say drive instead of pushing her away. He had always watched her more carefully than he had ever watched anyone, and he saw that smile, a sleep smile, the smile of someone who was finally resting, finally not afraid, finally sleeping beside someone without fearing that when she woke, they would be gone. Merrick faced forward again. The road was long, the day was brightening, and he thought about the design notebook in the bag behind them, the notebook he had opened every night for 14 years and then closed again, staring at the houses he drew for other people to live in, and wondering when the man drawing them had died. He had drawn so many houses. A house with a front porch and 2 rocking chairs. A house with big windows that caught late afternoon sun. A house with a backyard wide enough for children to run. A house with a reading room tucked under the attic roof. But never, in all those pages, had he drawn a single house with anyone sleeping inside it. He had never drawn someone stretched on a sofa, reading a book, or sitting on a porch with coffee, or resting their head on someone's shoulder with a quiet smile. He drew houses for people to live in, but he never drew people. Maybe because he didn't know how to draw people. Maybe because he never believed he deserved to have anyone inside the house he built. But now, with Bryn asleep on his shoulder, that small smile on her mouth, her hand still resting over his on the steering wheel, her fingers threaded between his, now he understood that the notebook didn't lack drawings. It lacked a person. And that person was sleeping on his shoulder in an old pickup truck heading west, farther from Boston, farther from the darkness, farther from everything old, and closer to something he had never had. He didn't know what to call it. Maybe it was home. Maybe it was peace. Maybe it was simply living without fear. The truck kept moving. The morning kept brightening. The road stretched on ahead. And maybe, sometimes, the most beautiful mistakes in life don't need to be fixed. They only need to be lived. And Bryn and Merrick's story pauses here, on an old truck driving toward sunrise. But it doesn't end. Because stories about people who truly love each other never end. They only turn into a new chapter. The girl who climbed into the wrong car because she was too exhausted found the most peaceful sleep of her life on the shoulder of the most dangerous man she had ever met. The king of an underground empire burned down everything he had built over 14 years because he wanted to see a smile on her lips when she slept instead of tears. Some people will say this is a love story. Some will say it is a story of redemption. But maybe, at its deepest, it is a story about getting back up, about losing everything and still choosing love, about being knocked down by life and still choosing to believe, about two broken people finding each other and deciding that broken doesn't mean finished, that a crack doesn't mean shattered, that sometimes the shattered pieces of two people fit together in a way no unbroken person could understand. The lesson Bryn and Merrick leave behind isn't love dangerous people or sacrifice everything for love. The lesson is this: when you have lost your mother, lost your father, lost your faith, lost even yourself, when you stand in the rubble of your life at 3 a.m. and think there is nothing left to hold on to, look again, look closely, because sometimes what saves you isn't money or power or miracles. What saves you is a warm hand taking yours in the dark and saying, "We keep going." And if you are watching this video late at night, if you are tired, if you are hurting, if you are wondering whether you still have the strength to keep going, remember that 16-year-old Bryn Holloway burned her first pot of rice and sat on the kitchen floor eating instant noodles with her sister. And she still got up, every morning, every day, until she found the person who could set a cup of coffee beside a blood-stained bandage without saying a word. If you believe that sometimes mistakes lead you to the right person, hit the like button for this video. If you know someone who needs to hear this story tonight, share it with them. Because sometimes the right story at the right time can change a whole long night. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories every day. Because we are always here, every night, telling you about ordinary people living extraordinary lives. We truly want to know how you feel after this story. What part touched you most? What part made you think of your own life? Think of the person you love. Think of the times you thought you had lost everything and still stood back up. Share what is deepest in your heart in the comments below. We read every line. We listen to every story. And every comment you leave is fuel for us to keep telling stories worth telling. Wishing all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, peaceful days, and always a reason to smile. Even a small one is enough. Thank you for being with us. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.